Here.
At this time, I'd like to ask if there's any members of the public who make a public comment on any item that is on the agenda. Please step up.
Good morning. Christine David, resident of Atherton for 20 years now. I just wanted to come back and share something with you that happened earlier this week. I was in our beautiful town administration offices, and I was looking at our original master plan that, you know, was about this thick, along with all the other ones before them, right? And I was flipping through, and I looked back to the beginning where we all had the meetings, and we were getting feedback from the residents, and I was so surprised to look at all the feedback and realize how much of that actually came through to the master plan. And then I flipped through and realized a lot of it really came from the residents. So I just wanted to remind you all that the residents really are excited about this. They're waiting for this. They want it as they've seen it, and they hope there aren't any changes to it so far, and support you funding it to go forward. So just wanted to help remind you of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Any other members of the public like to make any public comment that is on the agenda? Seeing none, I'm going to go ahead and close public comment and move right into Urban Futures, item number 1. I see Ms. Roberts. And Urban Futures. This is what
So I'd just like to present Michael Bush with Urban Futures. Just a quick presentation from them going over some financing alternatives for later on when we get to the project phase of this Civic Center Library project. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Michael Bush.
Thank you. Come on in.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Bush. We are going to get through this in 20 minutes this morning. That's the goal.
That's what I like to hear.
So let's just jump right in. We are on slide page 2. We're going to talk about constitutional debt limits that public agencies have throughout California. In most regards, cities are unable to borrow money for more than 1 year. It's in their typical budget year. There is a way to go around that process. It requires 2/3 vote of the public for anything that they want to finance for more than 1 year. There are ways to obviously borrow 1 year. We're going to talk a little bit about a TRAN. It's a revenue note. Essentially, we'll talk a little bit about that. There are some limitations to those processes. Basically, if you borrow in the year, you got to pay back in the year. It makes it a little bit challenging for capital projects. Most of the time, borrowings of that type are for cash flow purposes. There are 3 exceptions to the rule. As you can see here, the special fund doctrine applies to enterprise revenue bonds. Water, sewer, electric, and transportation are commonly financed under the special fund doctrine. There are other obligations imposed by law. Those basically are pension obligation bonds or judgment bonds. And the last, most commonly used, is the lease obligations, and that's probably the one item we'll probably spend the most time on this morning. There are, as referenced, some borrowing options for less than a year. Tax and revenue anticipation note, that's the TRAN. That's on the next slide. We'll talk about commercial paper, typically for larger borrowers. We've seen it in the city of LA, for example. City of San Francisco has a commercial paper program. We'll talk briefly about that as well. And then we will also talk a little bit about how these 2 processes may or may not fit for the town going forward. A little information about the TRAN. Short-term unsecured obligation to general fund. They're typically notes issued by corporations, municipal corporations for operational capital expenditures, likely for budget operations in the year. So I gave Robert an example this morning. The city of Oakland issues a TRAN every year. They issue the TRAN for 2 purposes. One, it helps their cash flow during the year. As you're all aware, property taxes come in later in the year, and oftentimes it's hard for municipalities to manage their operations without it. In Oakland, they fund half of their pension obligation up front, and it saves them interest costs. So that's the real driver of a TRAN for larger agencies. It's an arbitrage issue. It gives them an opportunity to get money up front, fund obligations at a lower cost, and pay the money back later in the year. It is somewhat restricted to 85% of the revenue. So for example, if the town wanted to issue a TRAN, it would focus on 85% of its annual general fund revenue. It's typically why we see these done in early parts of the fiscal year, because you can capture the most in July because you just started to collect. So oftentimes trans are issued around June for the following year and allows them to collect 85% of the following year's budget revenue allocations. So timing obviously is important. A rating is typically required, so you don't necessarily get away from some of the cost of issuance under a tran. What it does allow you to do, however, is to finance operational capital improvements for a short period of time, typically less than 15 months. Most of them are done for about a year. Commercial paper we talked about, maturity varies from 1 to 270 days. It is typically secured by a letter of credit from a bank. In this case, we believe Wells Fargo would probably be a likely candidate if you chose to go this route. Matures at the end of the term, can be rolled over for a new note, similar to what a tran can be done. More challenging, every year you go through the same process. So if you issue certificates of participation or, commercial paper, it's a process where if you're gonna fund your project, you're gonna fund paper and keep it moving over and over and over again. So a relationship with your bank will be important. And as emphasis needs to be replaced frequently, it's a lot of work to have a commercial paper program. Typically we see these larger issuers that have a dedicated debt staff, and the borrowing is typically in the $25 to $100 million range depending on projects. Oftentimes we see commercial paper being used to finance projects in the short run, and then they take out a loan, long-term loan, once they know exactly what they're going to do. Denominations are a little larger for paper, 50,000 to 5 million. It's a little different than the others. Let's compare private placement with a few retail investors to some of the other options. Private placement COPs. COPs are certificates of participation, are typically placed with banks. In other words, a bank will come to you and say, hey, we want to loan the town money. It's one option. The other option is if you have a investor or a few investors that are interested in investing. Typically we see this on the real estate development side, where developers say, hey, I'll carry my own note, I'll carry my own paper, but here's what I want to do. So there is an opportunity there for local folks to invest, not just in Atherton, but if you have others around, you can do that. There's also the ability to do that under a COP, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Private placements are used for two purposes. One, referenced here is a storied credit. Storied doesn't mean good. Storied means there's something in the background or the disclosure that you want to limit in a public offering, and you can negotiate a deal with the bank directly. That's one option for private placement. The other is short term, less than 20 years. It's one way. The second is you don't want to go through the cost of issuance components of having a lawyer draft up a bunch of documents. In most cases, you do not need a rating. So it does save you a little bit of money there in terms of cost of issuance. There's still a requirement to provide a lot of financial information. The bank still wants to see the background of the town and know what it's getting itself into. And you can do that through a bank. You can also do it through some individuals, as we listed in the slide. Certain net worth of $1 million, that's short of their primary residence, and there usually is some documentation that's required. So for example, if you issue a private placement to a few individuals, there'll be a letter with them that says you understand the details of what you're getting yourself into. That individual has to hold that paper or sell it to someone else that accepts what they refer to as a traveling letter or a big boy letter that says you agree to the terms of the notes. I've seen a similar issue in other cities. Beverly Hills and San Ramon, for example, were able to issue debt and engage their local citizens in the purchase of the bonds or the debt itself. They weren't able to buy all of the debt. I've not seen a transaction outside of a real estate transaction where one or two individuals have purchased debt for City Hall, for example. Here is a public offering of a COP, again, certificates of participation with a short call option. Interestingly enough, there was one just done, City of Malibu. Just completed a transaction. You'll see it here on the right side of the page. They have two different call periods. One's a 1-year call for $4.8 million, but as you'll see, it's amortized over a further amount. What that means, They can pay the debt off early, or they can just pay based on the schedule that's here. Another part of their transaction has an 8-year call. And again, it allows for them to pay off the debt, refinance the debt, restructure at the 8-year mark, or to continue with its obligations. A lot of the shorter calls are more common now due to the new tax law under the Trump administration that eliminated advance refundings. A lot of public agencies now want the option to restructure, refinance debt sooner. And so what we see in the market today is a little bit better value for doing so. It's now generally more accepted. And what you'll see here in the spreads, those negative numbers, those reference the municipal index for rates. And as you can see, the negatives refer to a better than AAA rate for the city of Malibu. I would assume if the town were to follow a structure similar to Malibu, you would have a similar process here, and I think you would have a similar spread given the town's financial condition. Town hasn't been in the market, Malibu has, but I generally assume that you would be viewed favorably in the marketplace. So short call options are certainly available to the town. Give a little more detail about certificates of participation. Their proportional interest in lease payments made by the town under a lease agreement. Well, there's a diagram we'll go through in the next page. It's basically a leaseback transaction. So the town will lease an existing encumbered asset. So in order to issue COPs, throw out a number of $5 million, the town would have to find an asset worth $5 million that it would lease through a nonprofit corporation. That could be done through a financing authority or a JPA that the town creates, or there's agencies out there that provide this service as conduit issuers on the behalf of cities and towns throughout the state of California. So we talked a little bit about the nonprofit needs to issue the obligation. You have to make sure that there's enough lease value in the asset to make it work. So there is a requirement for that. It is a liability of the general fund, but not subject to the constitutional debt limit. Creative lawyers found a way to get around certain aspects of the law. This is one of them. It does, and again, it does require that the asset be of greater value. So the next slide is really the important slide, I think, for the discussion we're going to have today. I'm going to try and make this easy to follow. On the left, we're going to go through 1, 2, and 3, and on the right in the chart, I'm going to explain to you which line is 1, 2, and 3, and I think the rest we could follow through. So the town leases an asset to a corporation for a nominal amount, $1. That is line 1 going from the town to the corporation. That's the top black line. The second bullet, corporation then rents asset back to the value. That's line 2. That's underneath the line from the corporation back to the town. The lease payments are that green line back. So this nonprofit corporation typically is a JPA. So a lot of you may have heard of financing authorities. Local agencies create financing authorities. That's the nonprofit they create. It's basically the same board. So a JPA structure. You'll lease the asset basically to your nonprofit entity who will lease it back, and it creates a revenue stream back and forth. That revenue stream then goes through the trustee. The trustee pays the investors for your obligation on an annual basis. It does require use and occupancy of a leased asset. It also requires that it be somewhat essential asset, depending on what you have available. It used to be years ago that some of the pledged assets were streets and roads, and I can't do that anymore. They are accepting of parks. It's not ideal. They love police stations, fire stations, city halls, and libraries and community centers, things that they're almost certain that the issuing agency would not likely want to give up. There have been cases where facilities have been given up. Stockton, in its bankruptcy, gave up its city hall to Wells Fargo as part of their negotiation, and the city of Chowchilla gave up its city hall when it couldn't meet its debt obligations. Just gave it back. The site didn't want it. So those obligations and those tactics create some strain on this process, but generally speaking, this is highly and most widely used in the state of California for this purpose. Let's talk a little bit about a public offering. Public offerings typically to multiple lenders. This is more likely referred to as a bond issue. But you can, however, open a retail order period to your local residents. And I referenced Beverly Hills and San Ramon. I worked on the San Ramon transaction. But I followed the Beverly Hills transaction fairly closely several years ago. In Beverly Hills, I think it was 30 to 40% of the debt was purchased by local residents. San Ramon is about 20. The way that works is the underwriter will set up a web page for your residents to kind of go and watch the transaction. It will have to work with its own broker to procure the securities on their behalf, but there'll be a separate order period that'll be retail for residents to call in. It could be the day before, it could be 4 hours before an institutional period, but they can definitely set aside some time for residents that wish to buy some of the city COPs, if that's the direction you go into, that they could. This will offer, more likely than not, a lower interest rate than a private placement. When you issue private placement debt, similar to going to the bank and you financing your home mortgage, for example, if they give you a rate of 4%, it's 4% year 1 all the way through year 30. Under a public offering, you have a blended rate structure based on risk. So the first year, the interest rate will be the lowest. The 30th year, for example, would be the highest rate, and then they give you a blended rate in between. If you look back at that Malibu transaction, you'll see some of those negative numbers in the spread column. That means that the investors viewed the risk of Malibu less than a AAA rated bond in the marketplace that day. In other words, they had the ability to pay. And if you also looked in the column, they'll give you some yields in there, and they were different numbers. Most of the time, the first year yield is 0.25%, for example, second year 0.5, then it goes up to 1, all the way up to like 2%. So you get that blended average, and I think in Malibu it was about 1.2 or 1.8% in total. So generally speaking, it gives you the lower cost. You can have a term up to 30 years. We've seen public offerings as low as 10 years with a call structure that we talked about earlier. It could be anywhere from 1 year through 10. We're starting to see pretty commonly now from our clients asked whether or not they can move forward with a 5-year term or a 7-year term. Seems to be pretty common. It will more likely than not be a more common practice in the marketplace as opposed to the 10-year traditional call that's been there. The town will commit to an appropriate annual lease payment from its general fund, so the debt of the obligation will be put into the town's budget on an annual basis. There will be annual reporting requirements. There are 2 under all debt offerings. One is you have to now comply with CDAC, that's the State Investment Debt Advisory Committee. They want to see what the town is doing on an annual basis. They require annual reports. There's also a disclosure obligation that the town will have to its investors, and that gets posted on a public site for the whole world to see. The cost of those 2 items, just so you know, going forward is about $1,200 total per year. Not a big percentage, but what that document will do is highlight where the city is financially each year. There'll be some conditions, usually in the loan documents, of what information the banks or lenders want to see, and all that will be provided. Typically with all public finance projects, prevailing wage still applies here, so if the town wants to build a library, city hall, or campus, competitive bidding will be required as part of that process. The council has the option when approving financing to set parameters. So for example, through a resolution process, the town would say, okay, we don't want to borrow more than X, we don't want to pay more than this interest rate, and we don't want to pay more than this much to the bank. And so those are the directions that your financing team will be following. And those could be not to exceed amounts. So hypothetically, let's assume that the town gives a not to exceed amount of $10 million, goes out and bids, and right before financing, bids come back at $8 million. We know not to sell more than $8 million worth of bonds. You may have given authority for 10, but you don't want to sell more than that. So you have some discretion. Once the town approves those options, the financing team, which is dedicated to the slide here, it's kind of gives you a little bit of role what everybody does. We'll take that information and go out and implement whatever financing strategy that you like. Under a COP offering, typically you would use all of these individuals. Under a private placement, the roles are a little bit different. For example, the underwriter serves as a placement agent. Under a private placement, will not be underwriting debt. Under the law, municipal advisors are not allowed to sell securities, so they're still required to use an underwriter. You will not need a rating agency or a rate more likely than not, so you'll save a little bit of money there. I think it's about $16,000 or $17,000. Underwriters typically charge somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 for private placement, and I think in this transaction, for purposes of presentation, I think we use $5 a bond as a measure for the next couple slides coming up. You won't need bond counsel, but you'll need some level of bond or disclosure counsel to prepare some documents for a COP. For a private placement option, you only need one of them. There's a savings there, about $35,000 under a private placement. And you still need a trustee, one way or the other. The trustee handles the cash flow between the issuing agency and the investors in the transaction. Talked a little bit about the cost of issuance. So in this case, a little bit of a breakdown. This assumes a par amount of $8.7 million. And this are some assumed fees. I think you've probably heard from my colleague, Wincy Fox. She put this together. I can tell you by looking at this, if the town had an interest in bidding out these services, I think the top line bond or disclosure counsel could be cut by, I don't know, 10 to 15,000. Title insurance is required on the leased facility. If you have one facility, title insurance won't be 10,000, it could be much less. And contingency basically is money that the town would use towards paying debt service the next year if it didn't use it. So, but I do think the 175, generally speaking, is probably not a bad number, but I would feel more comfortable if it was bid out, that we could probably be closer to about 160 or maybe even a little tighter than that. But this is just a good example of that. Timeline for transactions. This is a 90-day schedule here. As you can see, it has some assumptions on when things would start. It's my understanding the town is months, if not years away from deciding how it wants to move forward, but this just gives you an idea. I've done transactions as quick as 45 days, but the standard is probably about 90. 45 days was a rush needed to meet a deadline, but typically 60 to 90 days is about average. And basically what you might want to consider is once you get closer to your debt structure, that you complement this schedule with your schedule to award bids. So when you get ready to award bids, this process gets engaged, and we make sure that the timing kind of matches up with your project procurement process. A little more detail about private placements. Generally sold to a single number of accredited investors. These are banks typically. Western Alliance typically likes to buy these. That's a big bank in California that buys a lot of these obligations. There are several others. We typically bid these out for our clients. We have a list of about 30 different banks that we would send the information to, and we would receive bids back. Offerings, again, we would make on the behalf of the town, but the town would provide some of the parameters for that. The underwriter, as mentioned, serves as a placement agent in the transaction. And obviously the purchaser must have access to issuer information. So as part of the bid process, what's a little bit different about a private placement is you put a lot of information out front for banks to see and to bid. So they'll want to see audits, budgets, and anything related to your project, so they have a general understanding of what you're trying to finance. So typically a good idea to have that stuff available and ready if this is the structure you want to go through. And again, this is works more like a commercial loan. It's a fixed rate. And so there's some advantages to it and there's some disadvantages to it. Some of the advantages, shorter term process. So if the town wanted to finance for 30 years, which I don't think that's the goal, but if you wanted to, public offering clearly would be advantageous. Most banks don't want to loan money for more than 15 or 20 years under this structure. Process a little faster. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I think you can get these done a little faster than a public offering. There is no rating requirement. While there is no public disclosure, there still needs to be some communication. So you save a little bit of money by not having a preliminary or official statement. And again, once these loans are provided, it's very rare that they're sold. So the bank that provides you the loan typically holds on to its investment on behalf of the bank. Does provide a lower cost of issuance, what we talked about. It's a little bit of a timeline for a private placement. This process on the short end is probably somewhere between 30 and 45 days. Could take as long as 60 days. This process that we outlined here does include a bidding process. It includes lots of information made available to the banks to make sure that the town can get the best rate. And then there's a negotiating process as part of this. You'll note further to the right, that green circle says rate lock. When you bid out this type of financing, you can ask for the banks to provide you a rate lock. What that means is the date that they provide your bid, they'll give you a certain date for which it's due in order for the town council to get together and make a decision and to finalize any documents. Typically they're about 30 days, but you can request up to 60 days. Some banks, as part of their offering, will give you an opportunity to lock in at a later date, but they'll typically want to provide a little bit more interest. I think it's about 10 or 15 basis points, depending on how far out you want to go. I've seen it as low as 5, but 10 is pretty common. So even though this process may not be the most advantageous in terms of rate, it will provide you some certainty to that process. You will know exactly what the rate would be going forward. Public offering, you go out that day in the market, and the market will tell you where the rates are going to be. But we can generally, through comps, give you a pretty good idea, and based on credit. But the rate lock here gives you an opportunity to lock into something specific. Quickly, some advantages and disadvantages. No ratings are required. As I mentioned, that saves about $17,000. Limited ongoing disclosure. I think this is going to change right now. They don't require the annual reports to the SEC or MSRB. CDAC, that's the Debt Investment Advisory Committee, does require them. I think that will change should your financing last more than 5 years. It's been talked about quite a bit. The MSRB is taking notes on it and information from folks, but I think they want to start to disclose that information as well. There's no POS, that's the preliminary official statement. OS is official statement, so you'll save a little bit of money for there. You won't need a bond and disclosure counsel, you'll need one. That'll save you about $25,000. It's generally more negotiable and flexible with terms. Date when payments are due, frequency of payments. I mean, the banks will want the best deal they can get, and it may be advantageous for the town to agree to those terms. For example, bonds are paid semi-annually, could be under a private placement. Banks want to be paid monthly. If you pay them monthly, they'll give you a better rate. The execution we talked a little bit about, here it says 30 to 45 days. The rate locks 30 to 60 days. Those are some of the advantages. The disadvantages could be that, if you need, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it's usually shorter term financing. There are some requirements under a public offering for reporting that we talked about. Interest rates are often higher compared to a public offering. That's really what it comes down to. I think the town has a general idea of the borrowing term that it wants, where a private placement would fit in. The opportunity would be to either save money in the cost of issuance or to negotiate rates. I think that's the decision point for the town, this juncture. We've got a couple of samples I'll go through. Again, these are public offering. We've assumed, I think, in all of these that are in here, let me verify this before I say it, 10-year assumptions. So the borrowing term is 10 years. We assumed a bond rating of AA. I'm sure that on paper, the town is probably a AAA based on its financials. The fact that the town is small and hasn't been in the market, I think we're being a little bit conservative here. The good thing is you won't need bond insurance, you won't need any credit enhancements. I think the town can stand on its own. The cost of issuance of 175 we went through. I think we could probably tighten that up a little bit. This offering here is for $5 million. We assumed an all-in true interest cost, and true interest cost includes all the fees to the bank, to everybody that works on it, as well as your interest rate of 2.844%. Under that scenario, the annual debt payment would be about $528,000. In total debt service to borrow $5 million is, with principal and interest, is $5,814,000. So the $814,150 would be basically your probably interest cost. We would probably structure this where there would be some premium bonds in here where you pay a little bit more to the investor and they give you more money for your borrowing for exchange for a higher rate. It doesn't cost the town anymore, it's just a financing structure. The analysis here is the spread to MMD, and again, having that Malibu transaction really helped us out quite a bit to kind of look at that.
Mike, I'm just,
All right.
sorry.
It's okay.
I'm just running out
Okay.
So can you summarize just,
Yeah, I think, you know, just based on my conversations with Robert the last couple of days, I think the town really has a choice to kind of do what it wants to do. I personally think the public offering with opportunities for its residents, I'm trying to get to this last slide here. It's not working. Is there any way I can get to the last slide? It looks, it has like a, has chart, like columns on it. I think that's the one we need.
second last, right?
Yeah, second to left, sorry.
Page 22.
You're going the wrong way.
There we go.
There we go, thank you.
So this is it in a nutshell. These are the comparisons of different options, 5 million, 7 million, 8 million, and 10 million, 10, 15, and 20-year options. From my perspective, and you know, it's been a while since I've been here, but the last time we chatted about this topic, it was a cash flow issue. It kind of had plenty of annual revenue, but didn't have enough revenue at one time. So 10 years is probably the sweet spot, but I think the town in its financial position can have any call that it wants. I think there'll be a little bit of a cost to that, but I think it's worth the ability to pay something off early. It sounds like that's the town's desire. The finance committee last time, I think, said the exact same thing. So I still think the COPs, assuming the city has an asset it can put up, is probably the best option. I think it'll get a lot of interest from investors. It is the town of Atherton. Everybody knows where Atherton is, although it's not been in the market. I'm pretty sure you'd get some buyers, but I think also opening up the retail period to local investors would serve the town very well, I think. Not only from a PR perspective, but I think you'll get some good competition for people trying to buy the bonds. They'll all be serialized like they are here, meaning every year something matures. If you look at the denominations here, they're not too significant given the availability of individual financial perspective from residents and people around the town. It's possible you could sell all of it during a retail period. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if you did that. You just get a couple people to make some orders and they'll do it. The interest rate will be low. Sometimes that matters to investors and where they put their money. But I could see residents with Atherton pride buying at the lowest rate they possibly can and possibly saving the town money. The next slide is really a summary of the private placement. As you can see, the interest rate's a little bit higher. The debt service is a little bit higher because of that. I mean, you save a little bit of money on cost of issuance, but you know, the indicative rate that we've got from banks is still significantly higher than what we think you can borrow at. It's close to 3.3%. Rates are probably going to continue to go up. You know, we understand the FMOC will raise rates a couple more times. It will definitely affect this rate here directly. So I'm not sure this is the best alternative for the town. If it had a few individuals that were willing to buy all of it, I think we could still make the best deal through a public offering with an open retail period.
Questions for Mike?
Yeah, how does the interest rate and costs of the offering in a TRAN compare to the private placement?
The TRAN is a 1-year obligation, and so the interest rate is typically pretty low. The cost, you still have to provide a lot of the information still out, so there is still, you know, some documentation that goes out. I think the cost is probably similar to a private placement. The rate probably looks similar to a public offering, but the TRAN, you'd have to pay it off at the end of the year, and then you'd have to issue another one, so it's a process of doing it again and
So
again
you
and
incur
again.
that cost
Each time,
year?
yeah.
Elizabeth?
Just following on, can you pay it off with the issuance of a new TRAN?
You can, yeah, we're doing that now, but it's not ideal, the process itself, and I think where we're working on that process now, it's just, you know, town of Apple Valley, they're trying to acquire a private water company, and they're doing it to avoid a lot of potential litigation. So, and they're doing it to pay legal fees. They don't have enough money to pay
The
legal
other
fees.
quick question about that is, would it be a smaller amount that you would?
It's limited, yeah, it will be limited to 85% of your annual general fund revenue, and during that process, they'll make you set aside some part of it to pay it back. So, if 85% of your general fund is $10 million, you could borrow up to $10 million, but you'd have an obligation to pay it back.
Bill?
So Mike, maybe I misunderstood what you said, but You said in the COP, the council would set the rate that they wanted.
Not to exceed amount.
It's gonna be not
Yep.
to exceed.
Yes.
And then when you said, well, the benefit of going with the bank, you know, was that the rate was guaranteed, where the
Yep.
COP, the market varied. Well,
Yep.
it would only vary up to the level that the
That's
council
correct.
set, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, fine, thank you very much.
Yes.
Any other questions? Mike,
I
any?
have one more question.
Rick, please.
You said that in a trend, because it's a one-year payoff, the rate would be lower. Can you give us an indication of how that compares to your
Yeah, I think I can.
five-year rate?
Yeah, I think I can. I think if we look back at the Malibu transaction, that's probably what you would see, and that's on, I don't know the slide page, but right before 7, it's not listed, so.
Yeah, that-
I think that's a good indication of what a one-year rate would be. So it's a little less than 2%, it's about 1.87%. And again, I think a lot of the times we see trans is for two purposes. One, it's an arbitrage obligation. So example, if you pay off a lot of your CalPERS in advance, they cut the interest cost in half. So cities with large pensions borrow this money knowing, hey, the interest cost is less than what they'll pay to CalPERS, so it works in that regard. And the other is if you just don't have cash flow. I've not seen a trend used for a capital project yet, but could be if you plan to issue multiple trends.
Any additional questions? Well, you didn't do a comparison of the trend to private placement and the public offering.
And not a multiple year trend, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
We could do that and send it to Robert if you guys want us to. Sure.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Any members of the public comment on this item? Seeing none, I'm going to close public comment. Any final comments? Seeing none, thanks, Lee.
You're welcome. I will follow up on the trend issue.
Trust me, on the next one you will. We're gonna go ahead and move into item number 2, which is gonna be broken down into 5 different categories, which are going to be review and disclose the Civic Center project and update to include the discussion of project funding. That will be item number 1. And in each one of these items, I will bring it out to the public so that the public would have an opportunity to talk about or make a comment related to each topic. The second one would be to discuss and provide direction on the design changes and value engineering options for the administration and police department building. That will be item number 2. Number 3, direct staff to request a redesign proposal from WRNS. That would be number 3. Number 4, authorize the city attorney to prepare and city manager to execute an agreement with WRNS Studios to perform the redesign work for the library. That will be item number 4. And item number 5, authorize the advertisement for the public bids to provide demolition and abatement services for the library building. So can we move into item number 1, please? Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. This is just an update of, you see the updated report, that's what you've got in front of you now, the staff report and all the attached information, the detailed conversation with respect to the value engineering, Marty and the WRNS and MAC5 will handle. But the first item, as the mayor mentioned, is kind of a discussion of the funding. You just heard a presentation for Urban Futures, and the timelines, the cost, the impact, and the potential for that. So this is just kind of an open conversation on that same item.
Any of my colleagues have any comments related to the funding component of the project? Kind of an overview of what we just heard, actually. Bill and then Rick, please.
I think, first off, it was good to, get the presentation, understand what options are available. However, until we get the bids in, I think it's still premature to be making a decision on these things. Because if we open the bids to multiple construction companies, as I think Mr. Polito pointed out in the small finance subcommittee review a couple weeks ago, the rates could be substantially lower. And so I think this is a discussion on the finances and the cost of the Civic Center is something that we should have a little bit downstream, but we need to keep in mind this. There was a discussion in the finance subcommittee that there might be a resident or two that might want to underwrite the whole project. I think that would be more or less of a white knight type of situation, and I would be open to that. Other than that, I'm still hesitant on going into any sort of debt without the public actually having a say in it, which is the same position I had last time we discussed it.
Thanks, Bill. Rick?
Well, I think the discussion of the revenue anticipation notice is interesting. I hadn't focused on that before. What we're looking at here is needing to manage the cash flow, which is an annual issue. And we can do it by incurring a whatever 5 or 7 year, maybe even 10 year COP. I think given the revenue and expense management that we have very much focused on for these last several years, that we know we would be able to pay that back out of our revenue over the next few years. But if we can do it that way, then I'd like to look at the comparison with the 1 year note. And I don't think I know we don't need to borrow more than 85% of our anticipated annual revenue. So that looks like an option to me. And if we could do that with 1 or 2 residents, it would be ideal. I agree that's a white knight situation, and I also agree that that is not something we need to decide until after we see what the bids are. It doesn't make any sense to do it until we see the bids. But I'm not at all adverse to going out to the public and doing a bond. I'm not adverse to that, and I've said that before. We got 55% of the vote previously, or 52, 53% of the vote. We're in that range. I don't think that if we really built a campaign around this, we'd have any problem getting the vote. People want this civic center built. But if it's a cash management issue, the Tran might be a very interesting way to go, and I'd like to look at the cost comparison. And it's not an end run around a debt structure, because it's less than 1 year borrowing or 1 year borrowing.
Perfect, thanks, Rick. Elizabeth?
Well, I have to agree with Councilmember DeGoya on that, because what I perceive that we are faced with is a cash flow issue, and it's clear that we can afford to pay for the Civic Center in the outer years. It's just those last 3 or 4 years that we have to, less than that we have to kind of fund upfront. So if we can do these short-term financing vehicles that we can pay off at the end of the year. Honestly, I don't have a problem personally of even doing a COP for 5 to 10 year period like the city of Malibu is doing, because I don't think there's anything wrong in financing that last little bit of our Civic Center project funding in that way. And it's not like we're taking on a 30-year mortgage that we're going to have, like every one of us in this room has a mortgage on their homes, on their personal homes. And I think we are in a very unique situation where we actually have the majority of the funds to build the Civic Center. There's just the last component of money that we need some bridge financing on. So I'm intrigued by the trans model that we can pay it off every year, and I'd like to see the cost analysis of it. Otherwise, I think that the financing, like what Malibu is doing, is something that we should also look at.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Mike?
I think it's premature to have a lot of these discussions. I was so struck by how far off we were on our last bidding experience that it makes it difficult to have an intelligent conversation here. At this point, I mean, we're wise to look at all the options. I think it really depends on what the numbers come out. If indeed we're talking about a cash flow issue, and the way I interpret a cash flow issue is we've got sufficient funds, we're just getting our payments, in clumps, two occasions in the course of the year. That's an issue I think we can deal with pretty plainly. If it's something more than that, and we decided to go out to the public for a vote, I'll just note that sounds like a delay, and our experience with delays have not been good. So I would be extremely reluctant to delay the project, and I'd be much more inclined to drive the cost down as much as we could and get the project we want, but hopefully to make it more, at most, a cash flow issue, we don't want to get an ideal situation.
Perfect, thank you, Mike. I have to echo a little bit of everybody, and Mike in particular. Still seems a little premature. We're really cautious. I'm pleased that staff and the consultant at this point are reaching out to look at every option possible. Obviously, the feeling related to where the bids come in makes us unsteady on how we proceed at this point, but I'm glad that public conversation is occurring and we're creating options and we're looking and evaluating options to see what fits the best for us as a town as well as the taxpayers of the town, and then minimize that potential impact on our taxpayers. So I think that we are moving in the right direction, and we will continue to have a very transparent process related to the funding component, because I understand concerns on all parts. I'm very pleased about the information that we're getting, and I want to continue to have this level of information reach us and reach the public to alleviate any potential concerns or uncomfortableness, as anybody would think, as we move forward related to financing options. So I'd like to make an option here for any members of the public that would like to make a public comment related to this item. Please.
Christine David again. I was a finance major in college. And to me, looking at this, you guys are being extremely responsible, first of all, with the money that you have. And I personally want to thank you for doing all the work that you're doing to make sure that we do all of this the right way. But it seems in the end that a very small percentage of the total is what you're talking about in terms of needing to borrow for cash flow, the percentage meaning of the total master plan cost. Sounds great to me. It sounds like a really good idea, and it's a very small amount. So I'm just thrilled to hear it.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? I'm going to go ahead and close public comments and move on to item number 2. George? Oh, sure.
Bob was gonna say something.
Did you have anything?
Bob, were you?
No.
You see, you flinch. This is like bidding.
So.
Council members covered all bases.
Be careful with that. Thank you very much, Mark. Yes,
I
please.
just want to comment, I absolutely agree, and that's why it's before the council now, is that continuing public awareness, council member education, and transparency. It's not a short-term thing, we can't just do it tomorrow, it needs a council process involved. And so I think our next steps on this item is to have Michael from Urban Futures work with Robert to do that comparison of cost for trans, COPs, and private placement, and then have Robert overlay on top of that our timing and cash flow analysis, so that's the next thing that comes before the council.
Absolutely.
That should be a living document, so that we
Yes.
get the information.
And the closer we get to the bids, the more real it becomes.
And the more we feel it.
Just a little quick follow about the bids. Because once we get the bids, is there not a time frame for which those bids are good, before we have to pull the trigger? And so I'm concerned that if we drag our feet until we get the bids back, that without making some preliminary positive direction decisions on what financing vehicle or not that we're going to take, we may be up against a time crunch somehow.
So I will say, at this point, I think that we're probably going to be looking at the needs for funds in the mid-second year cycle, as well as the need of the third year cycle. And with a lead time up to 60 days, whatever option that we have 60 days to lock into it. So I think this is the good part, we're doing the work now, to be prepared for when those bids do come back, and then at that time, we can start crunching in the time frame that we need to
But
pull
we
the
can
trigger.
go ahead and pull the trigger with the contractor and start the project, and then
Correct,
we
and still
really,
be securing the
in
funding.
enough time
Is-
to secure the funding.
Can I just confirm that with the lawyer? Can we, Bill, are we able to move forward with a project when we don't have a clear plan to finance it? Is there some law that says you have to have a plan to?
Well, if you look on the first page of the document that was provided today, it explains the law very clearly. And as long as you have the funds, doesn't matter, I mean, what happens is we have funds, but they're budgeted to lots of things. If there was a true emergency, you find it,
Take
you
reserves,
could,
they
what the law
unallocate
says, you have to be able to pay each part of that 3-year obligation each year going forward, which you theoretically could do. It just means, you might not pay George or something.
Or our unallocated, unrestricted reserves, we've got 35% reserves and 20.
It just means if you had to take everything and dump it into a lump, could you then make the payment?
So that's a little better about the timeframe. Okay.
Good, let's go ahead and move to item number 2. So this is going to be Marty.
Good morning, Mayor, members of council. Thank you for hearing this. Item number 2 is going to be presenting, and if the clerk can put up attachment 2, please, on the screen. This is the value engineering options for administration and police building. As you are aware, on August 17th, you provided direction on the library, which is moving forward, and some items on our agenda today. And we have a very similar format. Once you see it on your screen, you should have copies of this in front of you that we use for the library. And John Schluter from WRNS is here today to walk us through this. And also John's going to be prepared to talk about some of the differences and what the recommendations from the consultants are regarding the VRF systems and the heat pump systems that I believe you got an email from last night from the city manager on. So with that, John, do you want to?
John, yeah, we're going to do it very similar to the way we did it last time. Don't feel pushed.
Yeah, that's absolutely, it's perfect. So as Marty said, thank you, Marty, for the introduction. Thank you, honorable mayor and council members, for another opportunity to present and answer questions today. Formatting is very much consistent with where we were, so just to reify what we had established here in terms of the summary document. The far left column is our bid design, and at the bottom line you'll see there the reconciled estimate, which brought us to a grand total of about $32.6 million. Now granted, we realized that was far above and beyond what our targeted budget would be for the project. So we were tasked with a budget goal of about 21.6. That's backing out of a 10% escalation. And so you'll see that number if you were to jump from the bottom line on the far left to the next column over, is the target that a reduced program, kind of a bare bones approach to get us to that target of about 21.6. Just again with the structure, a recommended column is the third column over, and this was something that was built with feedback from town staff as well as from the PNC group. And so we'll go through each of those items again. And then lastly, sometimes 3 categories aren't quite enough, right? And so to be able to pull those levers and give you options for cost management, there is a price alternates or deferred design column as well. And so that's our far right column where we can kind of continue to discuss further options per category. So again, if we were to just roll through line by line, so starting with the exterior assemblies again and superstructure, as you know, with the city, a focus on the city hall, which is our admin and police department building, a connective lobby, as well as the council chamber or the primary programs within the building proper. It's a 2-story building. Actually, I want to jump back one quick moment. You'll see that the first item on the top of the second column, this is the $7.3 million item. Notice that that is in bold red. And these bold red items are in that manner specifically because they are large items. I think if we're talking big focused amounts of savings, that those are going to be the areas that we'll find predominant savings. So those might be key discussion points as well.
Through the chair.
Please.
I just want to make a comment or a question. These are not net cost savings.
Right, it's a good
They
qualification.
are not net cost savings because it doesn't have the design, redesign numbers in it. Or the alternative, you know, if you don't do this, then all the other costs associated with, what do you do with it?
Right, no, that's a good point to make. These are all hard costs for the project, they don't include soft costs. In one of the footnotes below, I believe it was item 4, on the summary notes at the bottom right,
Yeah.
you'll see a range of those soft costs. That's sometimes not enough, and I understand that as well. So with regard to some of the more complicated coordination items like the building systems, we will speak to a range of understanding on the soft costs as well to help inform that decision, because that's a big one. So back to the reduced program column, the second column over from the left. First item there, in order to meet that budget goal, one of the really hard choices that we had to kind of look through and evaluate was the actual deferral of the admin building, community development. So that's the smaller of the two. You notice on the very bottom of the document, the diagram, that would be the omission of the admin, not constructing the lobby itself, and also deferring the council chamber. And so some key programmatic deferrals here in that option to meet that budget.
Can I
Please.
make a comment? So essentially, it's 21.6 million just to build the police
And associated site work.
and associated site work. Okay.
Now we would be building in some of the, the police would be built to a more robust sense, if you will, so that it could allow for the future of that admin. So from an infrastructural point of view as well, there would be some allowance there that's going to be towards that future. If I were to, I'm going to just march down, well actually no, let me march across just like we did last time for consistency. So we've itemized some reductions to finishes to look at costs. Obviously, deferral is one option if you want to maintain the design per the bid documents. But we've been charged as well to leave no stone unturned here. And so I think with the PMC, we did quite a bit of that. And you'll see reflected in the exterior materials below some of those items. They net out to a total of about $600,000. And in general, a lot of these are similar to some of the changes we presented with the library buildings again. So adjusting the glazing to an equal performing, but slightly less new and transparent glazing. Moving from steel frame storefronts at the lobby to more typical aluminum frame storefronts and curtain wall. The elimination of security level for the glazing, which was designed to a level 5 glazing. Looking at a reduction there. Level 4 doesn't bring a tremendous amount of value, but a level 3, a handgun protective glazing would bring some savings.
Can I make a comment on that, sir?
Please.
Level 3 is 3 shots of a Magnum 44, and level 2 doesn't seem too much different. It's 3 shots, protects up to 3 shots in the same location with a 357. So, to me, I don't know what the cost difference is between all the levels. I looked at level 1, and obviously I would think that, a 9mm Beretta is, probably too low, but what's the difference between level 2 and level 3?
It's all it's all about the amount of layers.
Well, no, I understand how it works,
Right.
okay? I did some research over the weekend, but I want to know what the cost difference is between 2 and 3. That you made a choice at 3 when perhaps 2 could have done it.
We have a consultant who does a lot of police departments, Eric Glass, and his recommendation was always initially level 5. Level 3 was something that he has seen, but traditionally police departments, new construction, have been moving towards level 5. And so his recommendation was actually to go more towards the level 5 than the level 3.
Well,
He did not recommend the level 2, so unfortunately I don't have that cost information. But what I can understand in terms of the actual construction, the jump from a level 5 to a level 3 was significant in the amount of layers that are removed. From a level 3 to a level 2, I believe it's a more minor reduction. So I would imagine just based purely on material, we're probably not finding as much savings as we would from the 5 to the 3.
I would thought that we would have at least looked at the option of what the cost would have been of 2. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think that there's not much difference. The level 5 was an assault rifle. I don't think we, obviously anything can happen, but this is not certain downtown locations where people are taking offensive to police actions. But my thought is, that I would just would have thought that it would have been nice to know the different numbers, okay, that's.
Move on, Jim.
A similar point to the library, the exterior mock-up. This is a visual mock-up again, not the performance mock-up. We still would prefer to do a performance mock-up and recommend we do that in place on the construction of the building. So keep in mind this is just a visual mock-up. I think we had a lot of discussion at the PMC at this one as well. Because the construction type on this building is a little more customary, it's a plaster building. Having that visual mock-up is not necessarily as critical as some of the finishes that are poured in place or rendered at a library. So I think there was some good feedback on, and we could recommend that pretty confidently. Precast Elements was another reduction, and this speaks to not all of the precast, but the precast that is actually kind of more at grade. We have a continual base at the building, which is a precast element, and we look to do that in poured concrete, essentially work the curb detail to kind of serve that base condition. In addition, at the archways, at the porticos, and at the council chamber, there were also some precast protective elements around those arches. Those would be removed per this item. We would recommend still to maintain the precast sills on the windows though, because of the deeper window base. I think it's just from a constructability point of view, a safer detail than looking to do that in plaster or in metal. So you wouldn't lose all of that precast look and feel on the project. The other one, and this was actually one of the bigger components here to drive this savings, was the last item, the asphalt shingle roof in lieu of the clay tile. We wanted to be able to talk about this kind of dollar for dollar. So if you look to the far right column there, you'll see that item broken out. If that is a driver for the project, it came in at about a $292,000 cost. And that's for the hip roof design for the current bid documents. I'll keep rolling if there's no questions or comments, and just stop me as needed. On the back.
I just want to stop, because he highlights that $292,000, if we want to have the clay tile, the look and feel of the buildings, which I hear from residents all the time, don't put asphalt shingles on the building that we're proposing. That number would roll over to the bottom line of this column. That would be an additional cost. And suggest build what we think it's worth.
Right.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor.
Please.
John, there was also some conversation around the asphalt shingle versus clay tile and where the potential future photovoltaic would go.
Right.
Is that what this option is, or is it
No.
the entirety of it?
This was an all around. But that's a fair point to bring up. So the original design, we did look at per the alternate. So the base design was clay tile. The alternate actually provided at the police building asphalt shingles and PV panels, right? Because it's a more affordable detailing. You're not going to see the roofing anyway at that point. So those penetrations would be much more easily detailed. It's worth thinking about. If you were to go clay tile everywhere, that in many ways complicates the addition of the PV down the road, assuming that that's still an alternate for a future. Another approach that could be taken is to say, well, we do although visually this is a little difficult to bear, I think, you could buy into asphalt shingles for the police department, knowing that you have future PV, and provide clay tile at the admin lobby. I think on day one, we might scratch our heads a little bit as we look at that and kind of wonder why would we have those two roofing materials. But knowing that PV is a likely potential here, just as we discussed at the library, the funding is there. It's, and obviously that was a decision to put that on the library with the recommendation.
So just to clarify, excuse me,
Please.
and just to clarify that if we were to make the decision day one to put PV on the roof, and clay tile, we would be able to do that reasonably with the, we wouldn't have to put clay tile and then remove it, but we'd structurally and installation, we'd do asphalt shingles under where the PV is gonna go, and just put the PVs up, and clay tile every place else.
Right. Yeah, that would be, if you knew on day one we're doing PV, then that would be the recommendation, is to provide asphalt shingles below those PV areas. The detailing is far simpler. I think from a roof perspective, it's just better construction. You know that you're going to need more access as well in those PV zones, and to have to access the roof around the PV with clay tile is a much more difficult proposition. So I think that's smart thinking. If PV is on the project per the original design, I would still recommend the asphalt shingles underneath that PV.
So, John, I'm sorry, John, isn't it, you're identifying in essence a Class A roof, because the asphalt shingle would be under shingle roof would be a Class A with a roll-on
Right.
composite, so you're basically describing a class A.
Correct. And that's the base, that was essentially the base design, right?
If you're, if you have someone, you can listen, just not participate. And yeah, I know you have issues, so commitments, I should say.
Yeah, let me-
Issues.
If I could just comment on that for a moment, because I want people to know that I'm gonna have to leave for this meeting fairly soon, and I want people to know this is a real priority for me, and the reason I'm leaving, unfortunately, the meeting was rescheduled. I had blocked off my schedule to a time where I could have stayed candidly for 12 hours, but when it got rescheduled, I had a previous commitment, I just couldn't possibly, I can't possibly move it, so I apologize, but in a few minutes, I'm gonna have to leave. I will try to call back in.
But I think at the time, he won't be able to publicly participate, but he will be able to listen to the conversation and the presentation. So, I'm just trying to make sure Mike still can hear what's going on, but cannot publicly participate according to the city attorney. Because our Uber driver will need to.
But more importantly, it's not noted on the agenda, which is required.
We don't even, I'm good. We're gonna talk about it. I don't want to waste everybody's time. I just,
Continue on, John, sorry.
Okay. If no further comment on the roof, then I'll move on to the ancillary building. So this is the building which is basically between the train tracks and the secure police parking yard off the back of the police building. The original design was a CMU block wall for the structure of that secure fence, as well as for the ancillary building proper, which serves as part of the fence of the secure yard. That was covered in cement plaster and had a precast cap, much like the precast we just discussed for the finishes. To find some value there, actually the addition of the plaster on all of that surface did have some significant cost, worth noting. And so we did look at changing the spec of that wall to be a more aesthetically pleasing CMU, it's a concrete block essentially that can be textured and toned and split to look a little more natural. By providing that finish in lieu of the plaster and removing the precast cap, we were able to find about $82,000 in savings. And we had some discussion at the PMC level about this as well. If that finish wasn't satisfactory, or if down the future we wanted to kind of provide more of a residential context, which is pretty common for zoning in your city, you could also look at planting in that area as well. And I think that's a nominal cost, but that is a future potential there as well. Maybe not with a day one impact, but it's something you could grow into. So that does sit within the recommended column, and again, that's at about an $82,000 savings. Onto the building systems, and I think this is probably one of the more complicated items here, and probably is going to have some of the more discussion around it as well. The base design, as you know from the library discussions, was for a campus air source heat pump, and that was sized at about 120 ton. It had site piping that connected the two buildings, and at the city hall and police and admin buildings, it was essentially a radiant system, meaning the lobby had radiant floors, the police department and admin buildings had radiant ceilings. This is really ideal for comfort, right? It gives you a tremendous amount of variability in the way you control temperature across all of those spaces, which with different programs, different operating hours, that actually means a lot, allows you to save a lot in terms of energy as well. So energy and comfort were pretty well suited, I think, to this system, and it also pairs well with your climate in Atherton, which is really more heating derived than cooling. It's a little more balanced than areas like up in San Francisco, but it's still predominantly a heating environment in lieu of cooling. The VRF system is the alternate that we looked at, and this is currently in both the recommended or the reduced program option, although we have an alternate, which I'll get to as well. Actually, let me jump to the alternate first, because I think it dovetails with the air source heat pump campus-wide. So at the library, we recommended to provide a single source, reduced air source heat pump for the library. So we went from 120 ton down to 30 ton. We also removed the site piping, and those costs were all within the library budget originally. So that found us savings at the library overall, which was part of the successes we had in the previous council meeting. The recommendation, so following through on that logic and looking for a sort of consistent campus approach, consistent to the original design, what we've looked at and priced was an air source heat pump sized at about 60 ton for the city hall. What this means is because it's local to the city hall now, we add a few things and we take a few things away. We've lost the site piping. We've lost some of the pumps that are associated with that to bring the tempered water across the site.
But those were costs
of the
library.
Right, and I'm speaking holistically, sort of between the campus efforts. That's a good point. But what we need to add is another heat pump. That's the 60 ton unit. And the size of that would necessitate us looking for a space in the secure yard. It needs to be outside as well. There is a location in that secure yard where the kennels are currently located. This is kind of on the southeast corner of that yard. That does seem suited to fit that equipment. So it's not to say we have nowhere to put it. We would likely need to just redistribute some of the secure yard. This doesn't appear currently to be at a loss to parking as well, which I think is worth noting. So all in all, that air source heat pump option being a local police option in a similar fashion to what we provided at the library, from hard cost came out to about $200,000. It was $198,000. Now I know we're trying to look at some of the design costs here as well and try to get a more robust picture of that. The changes associated with making the switch from campus-wide to a local system at the police would range from about $135,000 to $186,000. So all in all, as a sum total, we're looking at a range of this option that's roughly $335,000 to $384,000. That's an add. Just want to be clear that that's something that would add to the cost of the project. So the bottom line under recommended would go up by that amount. Soft costs excluded if we want to be apples to apples. I'm going to jump back to the third column now to describe the VRF then, just to compare and contrast. So that
Kind of trying to get clear on that. So if we did the campus-wide, which we eliminated a while ago, but if we did the campus-wide, would the whole cost of heating and cooling, both buildings being the library system, be in the library cost?
no. So
Just the heat pump would have been in the library.
the heat pump and associated site piping was included with the library, but
Okay.
other system components such as the pumps and some of the fans that are still required at a program like the police and the admin building are in the police project. And overall,
Was it cheaper
so
was it less cost for the actual construction? Because that's what the cost
Right.
we're not really looking at the design, and I realize we need to look at that too, but we're looking at the upfront cost. Was it less expensive to go with the larger system with the library
Yeah.
for this building?
yes, yeah, it is. And if I were to look at the costs,
Going back to that, because I didn't understand, that was not made clear in the meeting in August to me, and at least I didn't understand it. If the cost of implementation, the heating and cooling air system, if we go with the campus-wide, then it'd be better.
I thought that in August, we actually put a pin in this issue a little bit. We asked questions, there weren't answers, and we said, let's look at it when we learn more. And I'm very interested in knowing where both Bill and Rick are going, but it's nice to know how much this would go to the library, how much would go here,
Right.
and overall
I
campus
mean,
cost.
the overall redesign cost, we'll just eat up and savings.
Well, it'd be nice to know, love to hear like net at the
Right.
end of this.
Yeah.
and to get to your question, Bill, so where do these stand? I'm gonna just cut to the chase a little bit.
Please.
If we were to split the systems,
Yeah.
that's, from the city hall perspective, the most expensive option. We found savings at the library by splitting it, right? Because we took a lot of those costs that were associated with that out. So all in all, that net to net yields a small savings. It's nearly where we were. We came out with a quick calculation to about $120,000 savings overall to the project. That's including design costs, right? Where we were, you have to keep in mind, there's no design costs associated with maintaining that campus system. So that's no change, right? It keeps us focused in terms of the design, the redesign, which is a fairly tight schedule to meet the bid issuance for these documents. So I look at those two options and I see essentially you're either getting a campus-wide heat pump system with site piping, right? Or you're gonna split them relative. It's just a matter of whether you're paying us to do that work and find that savings or not. So that was the interesting find, I think, through that whole exercise is those are incredibly similar in terms of the cost that would be associated from your chair, what the town would pay.
Do we know what the delta is for the cost on the police and admin portion of the campus versus the library?
For the design changes or for the hard cost?
All in.
Okay, so from the heat pump side, that was about the $200,000 hard cost. The design fees on that are a little easier than the VRF, we'll talk about that in a second, which they were in the range of $135,000 to $186,000. Most of that's involved with cleaning up the site work, respecing the equipment, getting the mechanical room redesigned with the removal of those pumps, and then sizing and locating the new heat pump. all in, that total comes to about $335,000 to $384,000. That's an add to make that change. Granted, at the library, we saved about $420,000 with the removal of that. So that's where I'm saying that $120,000 number comes out to as a total savings. That's the holistic picture. If we were to stay with the campus-wide system, it's no change. The dollars are the zero where we were and where we would remain.
Those are design
Right.
costs.
Can you present the VRF system?
Yeah. So the VRF is a good system, and it's an energy efficient system, in that it's different than, I know there was some discussion around a DX as well, a direct expansion system. VRF is variable refrigerant flow, and that name says it all. The ability for that refrigerant to be pumped at different speeds allows you the ability to temper at different energy levels. I know you guys are probably aware of this as well, but that's where the energy efficiency comes in with that system. It is going to be air in lieu of water, right? So it's going to be a little louder. The comfort levels will be good, but not as good necessarily from a comfort and control perspective as the heat pump system. But both still very comfortable, good systems that I think have a particular benefit in terms of energy efficiency. They're both very good in that regard. The one key difference, I think, from the VRF perspective is the fact that those units are dispersed within your program, within the construction. And so that VRF system is actually going to be, it requires a little more maintenance in terms of filter management, as well as for the condensate lines. So those lines do need to be inspected periodically to make sure you don't get clogs. All that's to say is that there's some maintenance costs that are going to be associated with the ongoing upkeep of the VRF system.
But just make a comment. So I did a little research, because I didn't know what VRF was, so I looked it up. And I read 3 or 4 articles on it, and then compared to the DX systems and things like that. And, of course, we're trying to make the costs as low as possible, and there's been some questions, are we really over-speccing this building? And the very first article that I read, which was written by a very well-known person, said the VRF system is the Rolls-Royce of the heating and cooling system. That didn't send the right message. And it said that the downstream, people do it because of the downstream in the smaller buildings than this, primarily, not as large as ours. But the downstream energy savings, which I can understand why your firm would recommended it, can be 40 to 50%. But the cost of installation and the maintenance costs are overriding, and generally tip people really that are looking at a lower cost building as low as they could to go with the DX system. Yes, the DX system, is going to use more energy, but we're using 100% clean energy. So, to me, maintenance, the whole operation of the building is going to be different. But it just didn't send the right message, being the Rolls Royce of that. And you even said that, hey, this is the top of the line system.
They're both good systems. Yeah. And I think I'm glad that you've done the research. I think these kind of systems are very regionally specific, meaning that we wouldn't go and recommend a certain system that doesn't make sense for your community. And a DX can be good, but it doesn't provide that variability of control over the amount of heating or cooling that you're providing in terms of the refrigerant movement through the system. And so it's that compressor, it's additional compressors that do that work for you that allow you to do that. Now in terms of the design, they're probably roughly similar. We may need to design up a little bit for that lack of controllability within the DX, which is probably going to equate to a little more time and effort, potentially some more crunching in terms of what we can do in the ceilings. So as an option, sure, the DX is out there. Now, I think when you look long-term costs, this is a building that is not a 20-year building. This is a 50-year building. And so when we evaluate the systems and try to right size and make a recommendation that makes sense for considering the duration of the building, coupled with the notion of your climate year and the variability in terms of the program, that's what led us towards the VRF.
But what would be the cost difference?
I haven't analyzed the DX outright, so Paul, I don't know if I can you just provide any kind of rough assessment of it, but
Sorry.
DX, yeah, the direct exchange system. This is, I think, a new comment request, so I haven't had time to pull cost numbers, but do you have any rough sense of the cost perspective?
It'd be nice to know before we just made a decision on it. I mean, if it's significant, it's something I think that we need to consider. I realize that, like you said, there's some long-term costs, you're gonna use more energy, et cetera, but, and I would have liked to know, because we're trying to get the implementation cost down to a level where we can get the cash flow, and I guess that's really what my question was.
To round out just the final point on that, the DX system we see, and I work on several projects, some with smaller budgets that are very focused, and others with where the budget is not as focused. The recommendation about VRF is much more common than we see for DX systems. So back to the comment about the Rolls Royce here. I wouldn't look across the spectrum of a VRF from anyone who's owning and operating a building over an extended period of time as a Rolls Royce decision. I would look at it as a decision that says, this is the car that is going to last me through the years and can be dependable. And I would say the same for the heat pump. I think both of those are systems that, considering the use of this building, really make sense. So that's just to give a little context as to why the DX wasn't necessarily chased. But I can understand the value proposition and why you want to look at that.
John, is there a life expectancy difference between the two systems?
DX I can't speak to directly, but I think because the variability is going to be in your compressors. And I think ultimately with the compressor on a VRF, you can look, we've seen warranties that range, I think I listed 5-year in a write-up, they can range all the way up to 10, 15. Some manufacturers look at those parts and say this is a 15, 20. So it's really hard to pin down from one to the next. If warranty is specifically important to you as a town, that is something we can also look to spec in or have designed into the actual system. So it sounds like that's a point that's come up a few times. We can base selections for equipment or the design of the equipment around the serviceable life of that piece of
And it
equipment.
costs more.
Yeah, it's like a roof. You pay a premium for that.
That's right.
So to get to the costs then, and I think one other key point on the VRF system, it was worth noting and looking back through some of the early decisions that were made on this project. There was a commitment early on to avoid the use of gas combustion in these projects as much as possible, if not completely. And I think that direction is consistent with some thinking about refrigerant on the basis of greenhouse gases. We don't talk about this as much as we talk about energy efficiency, because energy efficiency is sort of a front seat item for climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. But I do want to be clear that refrigerants are actually one of the leading contributors and probably one of our future largest issues to contend with regards to greenhouse gases. So it's only fair for me to say, so you guys can hear it today as well, the VRF system would lean more on refrigerant use within the building, which in some ways is an issue that I think we'll continue to discuss further and further on the design of buildings. Whereas the heat pump system, while it still has refrigerants, is going to have a more controlled loop and a smaller amount of those refrigerants. And so it's just another point to kind of, for long-term thinking as owners and operators of a building, I think it's an important distinction.
So I could just get one more question on clarity. The campus-wide system, the difference between the campus-wide system and the cost, and I have to focus just on the cost that's going to be in the design of the building that we're talking about today. So if we went with a campus-wide system, you wouldn't have to redesign it, so there's no cost there. But are there any other cost savings to this building specifically if we went with the campus-wide versus this change?
No, it's a neutral at that point.
And the cost of the redesign is how much?
It'd be zero. We wouldn't be redesigning.
No, but if we redesign
For the heat pump or for the VRF?
for either.
So the redesign costs for the heat pump are, it's a similar system. So if we were to decouple the heat pump and provide two, library and city hall, that range was $135,000 to $186,000. The design cost to go to a VRF, which is a very different system, it's a system redesign essentially, had a higher design cost associated. That was anywhere from $192,000 to $285,000. So bigger price tag to make the switch to VRF.
Let me follow up on that, if I may. You haven't said it yet, but on the spreadsheet it shows that the VRF system provides a savings of $398,000.
Right.
That's off of the campus-wide design system.
Right.
So if you assume that the higher end of the design, it's about $100,000 savings.
Correct.
To go with VRF versus the campus-wide system.
Correct. So if you were to look at these all in, soft and hard cost combined, The VRF range would be 113 to 206,000. The campus-wide heat pump system is essentially zero, right? Because we're not changing anything. And then the single heat pump at the city hall was a range of an add of about 325,000 to 385,000. So that kind of gives you the spectrum there.
Okay, so I have a couple other questions.
Sure.
If we assume that we're putting in the PV, either because we're paying for it or we've got a PVA and somebody else pays for it, in order to reduce our going forward operational costs, and by the way, I think there's no argument that we don't do that, then does that have any impact on these different heat pump systems or VRF system? Because you know you have that energy source.
It's a good question. We talked with our engineering team around this as well. The PV doesn't necessarily have a direct impact from one system to the next. There are other measures, though, that potentially would, in fact would. The thermal energy storage tanks that we had proposed as an alternate did do a great deal of effort to reduce the heat pump size. And so the acceptance or a future addition of a thermal expansion tank on the site would potentially serve to, well, it would reduce your first costs, essentially, for a heat pump. I have to pull back a little bit. If you put that in later, you'd have to redesign the heat pump system. But the PV, to answer your question directly, doesn't have necessarily one direct.
So I understand the thermal tank issue, which is a separate issue, but in terms of the operational costs,
Mm-hmm.
looking forward over the next, I don't know, 10, 20 years, can you give an estimate on the difference between these three systems to the city hall component?
Right. So I'll start with
Campus-wide,
Right.
the admin, police, heat pump, individual heat pump, or the VRF?
Right. The campus-wide, holistically speaking, offered probably the greatest potential for savings overall.
I'm not looking
Energy.
overall, I'm just talking about the admin.
Meaning the VRF probably has the highest potential for energy savings, specifically energy, right? Because you can actually couple additional methods for energy saving, whether it's heat recovery. There's other ways to kind of further make that system more efficient. I couple that, or I'm gonna sort of lay on top of that the fact that you're gonna have costs in the ongoing maintenance and inspections around the filter replacements and around cleaning up the condensate lines and the drainage.
With the
So-
VRF system.
With the VRF. So in some ways that sort of balances out. The key drivers for that system are the compressors. And the compressors don't live forever, right? Every piece of equipment has a limited life. The compressors are probably I'm not gonna say Achilles heel, but if there were a piece of equipment that is gonna be taxed the most within the VRF, it's that compressor. So you may look at anywhere from 5 to 20 years down the road potential for compressor replacement. And that's where the warranty comes into play. It's
And
how
in
you
the
set that.
campus-wide system, are the compressors at the library, or are they in both buildings?
So this is where, and we have to lean on our mechanical engineers to kind of inform us. With the heat pump system, it's the condenser is the different system component that's really driving. The condensers also, they have a slightly longer life than the compressors do. They don't have to work quite to the degree because moving water and the thermal control of the water is a little less demand than the air. And so they will have a slightly longer life on the typical scale, and that's where the 5 to 7 year came in as a rough order of magnitude. Again, that can swing up to 15, 20 years depending on
But
how we
are those pieces of equipment in a campus-wide system at the library, or are they in both buildings?
at the library if we go campus-wide. It's the pumps that would be located over at the city hall.
Yeah, so,
Can we revisit that aspect of the library?
Is it-
meeting here with
so
on the
we-
agenda?
George, if we chose to go to the campus-wide system, can we make sure that that change obviously applies to the library? I don't think that we're that far along in the redesign of the
The next item is the actual approval of scope of work that WRNS is to do with respect to the VE selections that council made. So when you get to that item, you can just delete out any scope of work related to the heat pump system because you're gonna choose to stay with the campus-wide system.
Okay. Okay. Please, continue.
I think Just the only, there's a lot of factors here, and I think to kind of cover roughly all of them, the campus-wide system, one of the trade-offs with that was the fact that we had a large 120 ton unit that was outside the library. Once you reach that size, these can get pretty loud, and so it did require some acoustic screening. That would have been located behind the building we're in now, within an acoustic screen. By decoupling it, we are able to kind of reduce some of that noise pollution, and I think some of the design factor and cost associated with that screening would also be removed. So it's just another consideration acoustically.
So, taking that in consideration, next door to the neighbor.
Correct.
So, I mean, and then the cost, obviously we have a cost estimate for that, insulation, sound insulation.
Should be an existing system.
Yeah,
As
the
opposed to
existing
one that's
system.
Correct. Right, and within your code and zoning
Yeah.
requirements, those specifications are in place. What
Yeah,
decibel
yeah,
levels
that's
are allowed. So we've designed with the acoustic engineer this system to meet those requirements.
And it doesn't run all the time. It
No,
runs,
no,
it
it-
fires itself up.
Right, it actually tends to run more in the evening and night than during the day, which seems
And
counterintuitive.
everything's kind of quiet. That's really good.
It's all about programming. Correct, it's all about programming your timing on your flow of your system.
Correct.
Gary,
Go ahead, please.
So my final question, in George's email that came out yesterday, which raised the DX system for the first time, there's two comments on this that I think are important, I'd like to understand better. One is, and I think this is probably a quote from WRNS, in the campus development approach, having a central plant tied to the heat pump located at the library made the most sense cost-wise. Okay, that's one. And then due to the balanced performance considerations and the timing of releasing the bid package, the design team recommends the separate heat pump option.
Right.
And that, I'm assuming, is comparing the separate heat pump to the VRF.
Correct.
Because to design for the VRF, which is more costly, is gonna take an additional 2 months.
No,
Is
that's
that right?
that's correct.
So
Obviously the campus approach.
between the campus heat pump system and the separate building heat pump systems, what is the design team's recommendation?
Well, I think we would recommend where we were, which was the campus heat pump. It's less equipment. I mean, and it is designed already. I realize we're under a tight schedule here to meet the bid package as well.
And just from staff's perspective, separate from the architects, does staff have a preference and recommendation?
We would prefer as designed.
Well, that's the path of least resistance.
Well, I think it's
So that's
just
a
the
big
most
deal.
intelligent, solution.
That's why we ended up with that.
Right. Reduce equipment.
But, all right, continue, John. Sorry, any other questions?
No.
All right, please, John.
No, so I think that hits at least the general points. I know there were a lot of questions around this, so just to summarize, I think again, in terms of cost and putting our arms around hard and soft, the VRF would still offer the most savings, right? It was $398,000 in hard costs, with a cost to redesign of about $200,000 to $285,000. That range of sum total gave us a range of about $113,000 to $206,000 overall. That's the least expensive, but it's the most effort design-wise. And I didn't speak to it yet, but the time associated with the change to a VRF is probably a 4 to 5 month effort. It's a pretty involved system change. The change to a heat pump, local at the library, local at City Hall, was probably a 2 to 3 months, so about a 2 month delta there in terms of our effort. Now, obviously, we're going to tune our focus to make this happen with the bid date. We realize that's a primary driver. But in terms of an effort to give a rough sense of scale, that's really what we're looking at from a manpower perspective. Cost-wise, these isolated heat pump at City Hall and at Library, the 2 heat pumps, speaking strictly for City Hall, was a range of about $335,000 to $384,000. That's including hard costs and soft costs, and that's an add. Whereas at the VRF, we have a deduct. What we found with the overall, obviously, was a net balance of where we were, because it's essentially what we designed and what we already have priced.
You guys don't really need the additional design for
Well, and you know, part of that as well, I mean, you guys, you want to spend your money towards things that are physical and what you get. And so I recognize that our design, while you may appreciate it, at the same time isn't necessarily something really you get to hold on to or operate or experience with your building. And so
And
it does.
John, just so you, this is obviously why we're going through this process, to see what the balance is. And that's why we wanted to expand this a little further, because we needed to understand with the original system design, and now we're already into that design component, if there can be a cost savings, well, what potentially is that cost savings, and then long-term maintenance and other things are, and obviously the library component issues are all attached to that item, which is a big ticket item. So
Mhm.
that's why we're all deeply concerned with where these numbers are. Rick, please.
Yeah, so if we went back to the campus-wide system, which will not include the cost of the additional 2 months, which means we're not gonna meet the December, January timeframe, right? The last thing I think we wanna do is end up in a situation we faced this year with a late spring due.
Exactly.
But when I include the costs of the time delay, it reduces the savings to potentially $50,000. The campus-wide system included this thermal tank setup that I understood when it was initially proposed that PG&E Savings by Design was going to pay for. And I know we had a meeting with PG&E Savings by Design early on when WRNS initially proposed that. And I don't know how, and I think that's out, right?
I think it was an alternative too. Right?
It was not base, it was an add alternate, the tanks. But you're right, that is an item that PG&E at that time was offering full rebates on, to add that equipment to a campus-wide design. There were some key drivers on that as well, because PG&E is a utility, they did require that you were not net zero, at least at the time of the receipt of that rebate. And so there are some political maneuvers there and some stipulations that were important to kind of keep in mind. They evaluate their savings by design guidelines and essential rebates annually. So it's something we need to look back into as to what they're offering currently for the TDS.
So I think we probably have a resolve on this, but you need to be told.
I can do it.
Wait, what are you gonna move forward on this? Because,
We're going to make a decision, because we are currently going to be making a decision on the next step as well, which I believe is going to echo some comments here.
okay,
So I think that we're going to come up with that.
okay, all right. I just wanna make sure we get it
Ron,
right.
you're going to get it, President.
On to the electrical line item. So we had a lot of discussion around whether the savings associated with VEing lighting was really valuable, and that is a heavier coordination item across the trades, and that's why you don't see it reflected in the recommended column. The PMC looked at that soft cost and said, we don't necessarily see the value here. The emergency power, so the base design was for a 500 kilowatt generator with a 4,000 gallon fuel tank out in the secure yard. We had the alternate there for the microgrid emergency power system. You can see that on the far right column, and that is an add of 1.65 million. And so, just as a reminder, at the library, what we had done with this item was actually provide the infrastructure for that microgrid, but not the units themselves, not the batteries. But in the case of this as the base design, that was, the microgrid at the police was always the alternate, just as a reminder. I know we're being limited in the alternates that we provide, but that is something that would be relatively straightforward to maintain as an alternate if we wanted to keep that pricing on the table with the bids. The PV system, alternate PVs and supports, fall arrest, and changing the roof below. So the base design for the PV was always to go, base design at the police building and at the city hall admin was clay tile roof. The alternate in that case was the PVs at the police department. And so you can see there on the far right again, that was an add in the alternate category of about $650,000 to put the PVs on day one. The deduct associated with that, in terms of the roof and whatnot, was at $59,000. So net out $650 on the hard costs for the PV panels. We had some discussion as well around the other PV that was on the site, and these were alternates by way of carport canopies that would be along the rerouted station lane. And that was an expensive item. It's a lot of structure, and lighting, and then the panel cost as well. And because they're remote within the site and with the infrastructure connections back to the buildings, that costs to nearly $1 million.
But it was always an alternate.
Always an alternate.
Right, so.
And it still is.
And that does include, just to be clear, the ancillary building as well. We were looking at providing PV along that flat roof of that building. Onto the site categories, and I'm assuming we'll just roll through here and then maybe go back
Well,
through.
wait, let me just ask a question about that. If we didn't do the PVs, then would the infrastructure be there anyway? I know on top of the carports it wouldn't, but the conduit would, whatever you.
This number reflects all of those costs. So we could still provide the infrastructure. It would be a nominal cost if you wanted to plumb, so to speak, for the future carport.
Yeah.
But we're not building the canopies.
Just a point of clarity, John, the base building components that we have, the systems design, is plumbed for the expansion capability, correct?
For PV, yeah.
Okay, that answers the question. Yes.
That's for the roof,
Perfect,
not
John.
not for the
Not
site.
necessarily
not
to
for
the
the carport.
cardboard.
So that's
because-
a different story, it's
Right.
not plumbed to be
Yeah.
out in the parking lot, but the system itself is designed to expand in the buildings.
Yes.
Correct.
As we desire.
So then on to site, the ground cover at the police department, we actually provided a variety here around a lot of comments. It was a mix of decorative planning and native vegetation, which would be lower maintenance, lower irrigation costs. But the decorative plantings were really important, I think, from the design committee's perspective around the base of the building, the city hall. It's got a lot of frontage to Fair Oaks. To find some savings here, we looked at what was one of our deduct alternates, and this was the hydro seed in lieu of that planting per design. In either case, that would get us savings of about $162,000. That does come with an additional increase in some of the irrigation demand, and that's built into that number as well. The furnishing and fencing, so there were.
Can we talk about that real quick? You know, we said as a group that we wanted to have the plantings around the library, and then suddenly when we walk over to the civic center, it's gonna be the desert. So I think that might be a short-sighted approach. And many people are just gonna see the outside of the building, they're gonna drive by it, and so we wanna send the right thing. So I think that really, yeah, personally, I'd rather have the outside look nice when people are going by it, because most people, that's all they're gonna ever do, all right? So I think that that's a short-sighted decision. I think that especially since we're doing the library, we should reconsider at least something, maybe cut back a little bit, but I think we need to have more than just hydro seed, okay? That's my view.
I think we should take that savings out and just, plan according to our plan was. I think it's well worth it. Although, once the building, if we take it out of the bid packet, and this is something that we may want to think about, instead of giving the contractor the whole job of doing the landscape install, we could kind of pull that out as a separate contract, so then it's not part of the contractors.
Rick, please.
So, I guess I have two thoughts about this. One is, and we're paying for this building out of general funds. And I actually don't mind the residents seeing a difference between these two buildings at the time that we're ready to move into it. It shows that we've been as careful with the cost management as we are being. But that's my first comment. So I don't have the same opinion that Bill expressed. Although I don't want that situation to last for long. And I think we'll have the revenue to address it. So in some, the way I look at this, it's kind of pulling the costs from the bid package into FFE, like we're doing with, I don't know,
The site furnishings.
some stuff in the library. If I'm wrong in that assumption, then please, George, you should correct me. But I don't have any problem moving the landscaping from the bid package to FFE, which is what I think this does.
I don't think so.
This
No,
did
no, it
not
doesn't.
assume that it was a deferred soft cost item.
No.
But there's nothing to say that we couldn't
Well, but that's just making a decision at some point to,
It wouldn't necessarily be FF&E, it would be done as Councilman Lewis is saying, after the project gets completed,
Yeah.
we go back and assess what landscape you want, and
Right,
And
because this, I just want to
if there's
clarify.
a material cost in doing that, I understood from previous questioning that the irrigation systems would be there, so we wouldn't have an irrigation cost.
It's fine.
It's just plant material and putting it in.
But let me just clarify that the $162,000 is not the total landscape budget,
No.
right? If we took the whole landscape budget out of the bid packet and, gave it to a landscaping contractor, outside of the bid packet, how much would we save in this, bottom line?
So,
Is that the?
well, I think that might not be the best choice, because you've got hardscape and softscape, and you got BG and other things that you're gonna want to be putting in, along with irrigation that makes up to your buildings.
But the contractor's gonna contract out to a landscaper.
Yes, we'll do it concurrently with their construction. And you do say, you do have some overhead associated with that, of course, and
Right,
management, but
which,
separating that post-project may create some oversight issues
So-
and connectivity.
It could be more complicated.
So I will say that I have to agree with Rick, and we have to cut somewhere, and we're trying to be as responsible and drill down as possible. And if we have a hydro seed issue to deal with until we can, evaluate the funding component, we have subcommittee groups that I'm sure would love to get involved in helping us at that point, but for me, I'm okay with putting this on the hydro seed component, or frankly, leaving the bare dirt until we can afford to do it, or evaluate doing it. Frankly,
Okay.
so,
There you go, very good. Take the hydro seed out.
I think the little long goes out so we can design and plan. So, move on, please, John.
Yep. Next item, site furnishing. There are benches, chairs, and tables along the pathways along the civic court. This also included fencing that was along the relocated Ashfield Road that was originally in Garapa. We have looked at reducing that down to cedar, and you'll see that broken out as a second line item here. We isolated furnishings and then that fencing component. These live in both categories. The furnishings as an item that could be pulled and put into an FF&E budget again. That was $18,000. The fencing change to cedar is a $12,000 savings. Those were both recommended changes. The next ticket item is a large one, and this is essentially not doing the scope of work at the courtyard, which had some cost associated with it, predominantly again around canopies that were over the waste staging area, the mixing area out there. There are some requirements in terms of drainage that need to be addressed out there, but I think what we've discussed with the town is that would just be a separate project from this Civic Center project. And that also included the demolition of the Public Works building, which would need to be a second effort, separate from this project as well. But that grand total, just to hit the number, that was $837,000. So that's a large savings from the project. The lobby finishes, and so to describe what we currently have in the lobby is a 2-story space. It serves as the entrance for multiple programs, be it your reception for City Hall and admin. It's your police department entrance. It serves a stair and elevator connection. There's a post service and a parcel drop point in that lobby as well. So it's a lobby that's doing a lot. In terms of the finishes, we have an acoustic fabric ceiling, much like what we discussed at the library. Within that lobby, that does a lot of work for us in a big volume like that to reduce the noise. And it's articulated in a way that's really consistent with the building exterior. We have exposed wood structure, it's wood-clad beams within that space. This is consistent with the rafter tails that are outside the building as well. The bridge connection that would essentially lead you from the police section of the building over to your community development had an underside that was clad in wood coffers as well, so something consistent with your casework, and the look and feel was very much of the building. To find some savings, I'm going to jump to the recommended column. This is the smaller of the savings items. We looked at reducing some of those finishes I just described. So the acoustic ceiling Within that third column would go to a plank ACT system. Again, not so dissimilar from what we discussed at the library. The wood cladding on the steel beams would actually go away, so we would express that steel structure instead in the space, or cover it within the ceiling. That's a design item we can look at. We would look at replacing and simplifying aspects of the railing, which was a wrought iron rail with a teak balustrade. We would look at, rather than fascia mounting that rail, potentially ground mounting the rail to save some costs, and looking at painted steel in lieu of the iron. We would also look at a wood that's probably more in line with what we looked at in some of the reductions in the library, whether that's a cedar or an oak for the balustrade. So you could still have some wood elements within the space, but I think overall these value changes are looking at a different feel overall for the space. It's going to feel a little more modern. I just want to qualify that it's not as consistent with that original design from interior to exterior, just in terms of that feeling. But that does bring a savings of about $426,000. So it's not a small ticket item. If we wanted to take that to the far extreme, you'll see under column 2, I know I'm jumping here, see two-story building above, and that means that we can recognize it in the diagram just by omitting that lobby and redesigning the entry for those spaces that I listed earlier on, would be a component of a full $7.3 million savings. So that was the extreme change, was just don't build the lobby. Whether we defer that or if we were to build a bridge or a canopy.
Well, you don't say $7 million by not building the lobby.
That's
You say $7 million by
not building the
library
admin.
and the admin
Right.
building. Okay, so
Was there,
just,
John, was there a discussion of reduction of space, meaning 300 or 400 square feet, 400 square feet of the lobby area?
Yeah.
And what that cost would be, and do we know those costs and the design differences, what's the value of it?
Right.
Just like the heat pump.
So the cost per square foot, working with the estimators, the cost per square foot in that lobby was about 500 to 550 square foot. To find that savings, you would probably need to take 400 square feet from that ground floor level. And that's where it gets a little more difficult. And it's across two general spectrums. I think the first one has to do with the amount of uses, right? The amount of sharing that's occurring within that space in terms of entry points. You've got a long space that's about 56 feet long by about 25 feet wide. And we've lined up addresses all within that space, right? The police door, the elevator door, the stair, the access to the restrooms.
Did you pick, Teresa, the visual that you produced for that?
She does have it. It'd be on my stick there, Teresa, if you want to pull it up. If you go to the folder, it's not within that packet. I apologize. Within the folder, it should be. Yeah. And then lobby VE reduction, the fourth one down. So this represents the base design for that lobby space. So you can see those addresses I'm kind of speaking to on that interior, the police access from within the lobby, the elevator access, the stair, and then the toilet rooms. And those toilet rooms are going to stack up onto the second floor as well. So 3 of the 4 of those are stacked. The police exiting is occurring on the second floor of that side of the building, that east side. On the west side of the building, you come in, you have a very modestly sized donor wall space with a small amount of seating. I think we have room for probably 2 to 4 seats within that space. The parcel drop, the reception desk for admin, and that admin access point where their front door is, and then the post-service desk was at the far corner of that. So if you flip to the next slide there, Teresa. This represents roughly that 400 square foot savings, and I think, frankly, we have to kind of look at this from the north side of the space, from Fair Oaks, in lieu of the south side, because the toilet room access is just too critical. It's pretty tight. So what that would provide us, architecturally speaking, is the idea of the north court. And this is something actually with the CCAC we talked about earlier on, is what's the character of that Fair Oaks entry. The problem is it's on the wrong side of the building, frankly. A courtyard that's north facing like that and within a sort of confined 2-story space is going to have a tendency to feel shaded and cold. It further extends the amount of distance from the car to the front door, which was something we really tuned to the design of the building as well. The other thing that it does is it kind of cuts off the access from the police. We already had 2 doors for the police department. One that was within the portico and one that was within the lobby space itself. And that was all around hours of operation, right? When the lobby's closed, it makes sense to use another entry point into that police station. The other thing that did, which was really important, it let the police department, especially from that dispatch, that sort of front desk for the police. It gave them eyes to look outside from their desk as well as within the lobby. And by pushing this in that 16 feet to make the reduction, we've really cut them off from that lobby interior.
Is there a door in that 16 feet?
The door would have to be here. So the two doors originally were there, and by shifting in, we've kind of eliminated that interior door potential with no police. That's not to say that you couldn't find a way to maybe reconfigure the elevator output, but from a line of sight perspective, it's not as open to that lobby space. The other thing that we'd be giving away in terms of area or program was that donor wall, so the large donor wall recognition element. You could obviously have a smaller donor wall. That's something that's pretty easy to design on. But it does take away some flexibility in the space. You'd lose the ability to have seating within that as an overflow. And that, I know within the space you have now, the post has a tendency to back up at peak moments. So having some additional space for seating is really, I think, something we'd recommend within a lobby like this. And then lastly, we had talked around some flexible space.
I apologize, is there not enough space in the additional 2,000 square feet to seat people? I mean, we're eliminating 400 square feet, are we taking 400 square feet seat?
The ground floor footprint was 1,500 square feet, so we'd be going from 15 to 1,100 at the ground floor. What we intentionally, with this study, tried not to impact what's happening upstairs, because this is actually a programmed area. That's plan check and prep and waiting for the community development area. So we tried not to impact that. Unfortunately, I think there's some wayfinding issues here as well. We had a larger opening, which allowed you to understand intuitively as you walked into that space, oh, that's my permit center upstairs. Whereas now, with those narrow slices, it's a little less recognizable. We'd have to lean on signage.
So, in an interest of trying to push this a little bit forward, let's get to the number. Let's talk about the cost savings, the potential cost savings, the redesign cost. If we were to consider 400 square feet,
Right.
There would be a slight modification of adding a potential door into the police department to have interior access to go. But let's just really get down to the numbers to see if it's even worth further discussion.
So the balance in terms of savings that we look at, if it's a 400 square foot reduction, the cost per square foot, again, being 500, 550 in that range. If you looked at 525, that puts us at a savings of 210,000 for the change. Design costs, because this space is actually one of the more complicated in terms of the structure that's associated with this move, we're impacting the exterior wall, mechanical systems and how those distribute into the larger volume of the lobby would also have to be redesigned. So it's involved. And because we're making changes to the police program, we want Eric Glass as well to kind of weigh in on that. That range is anywhere from 150 to 225,000. So you could find some savings potentially, but I don't know in the end if, again, you're trading the value of a flexible space and the design that we kind of worked with you to build for probably a $50,000 to maybe $75,000 savings.
Out of curiosity, what would warrant the 225? Because then this is going to cost us to redesign.
There's a lot of variables we still haven't pinned down with regard to whether we're doing rating in that space, whether we're accepting some of the other finished changes. So that's why we have to lean on ranges here. We can't, it's really hard to pinpoint one specific number.
Any questions from my colleagues on that? In consideration for a lobby redesign within or square feet?
I don't think it makes sense to take time on it, there's no savings.
Elizabeth?
I don't think there's any savings, and I think there's a very, very compelling argument.
How much time
for
is on to
reducing the size, and I think John hit on the high points. It will make the entrance to our new civic center dark and dingy because of the north facing, and it just is, it's just a wrong idea. And it's just for the potential savings, even if it was just $200,000 and no other design costs or other soft costs involved. And I just think all that savings would be met by design and reconstruction costs.
And John, potential design delays?
It's a range of like 4 to 8 weeks. Certain consultants have minimal involvement, whereas other consultants would be heavily involved in the change. So in terms of the basis of these numbers, we've looked at the 6-week period to kind of
So
generate those
the
things.
time is
Bill?
Yeah, my position hasn't changed since November when we first looked at this, and we said that we thought that the library was too grand and it should have been redesigned at that time. And I still feel it's $2,000. If we're planning on having dirt, because that's what we want to show how conservative we are, then I think that this is $2,000. And it should have been smaller. Several people in the community have talked about the grand lobby. So I personally think that the savings actually would be better than what's projected here. I can't comment on your cost, but I'd rather see a smaller lobby, and I understand that it's 3 to 1, so fine. But I think it should have been done when we first brought it up.
I have a question for John, because when you were going through the new interior finishes, recommended interior finishes, you talked about exposed steel beams instead of recladding those beams. Would those be steel I-beams, or, I just,
That's the most value.
I'm just having a pump.
Yeah, for the numbers purposes here, we were considering more standard steel members, not, for instance, WT sections. We were looking at WF sections, so typical steel I-beam in lieu of something that was more decorative.
And so they would just be exposed?
They could be exposed if we want to express the rhythm of that structure, which would be fairly consistent. I mean, keep in mind this is a double-story space, so those are up and.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time thinking how many of them are there, because what we had talked about is wood cladding them
Right.
to make them look like timber,
Right.
right? Timber beams.
Right, and if that exposed steel was something from a design perspective that's not acceptable, then the other avenue we have from the value-based proposition is to look at where that ceiling plane sits relative to the beam.
Right. Yeah. I would just, I appreciate the $426,000 savings. Don't get me wrong. I just, and it's hard to make a real educated decision because I don't see I don't see a finish. And I do believe, I support the eliminating the sliding wood gate at the community development reception. We decided that was not something that was necessary for security or anything, and so I would think that was a big savings. The acoustic fabric ceiling, I think, is a nice to have. I think it's good for the library because of the sound. I think that if in fact the lobby turns out to be so incredibly noisy over the years, after we're working and living in it, that a modification can be made at that time to do sound dampening.
And towards the acoustics, I didn't speak to the veneer plaster. So the acoustics are a real issue in a lobby in a space like this with the geometry and the size. It's a lot of hard surfaces. And so we have designed acoustic plaster, and this is similar to what's designed for the council chamber as well, and that's doing a lot of the work too. That balanced with the acoustic ceiling, I think, can get us to where we need to be in terms of that acoustic design. I don't think it's going to be a tremendous negative. The acoustic fabric obviously performs very well, but we would still maintain the acoustic plaster on limited surfaces. Now, what I want to be clear about though, we were providing a veneer plaster then on the other surfaces, the other 2 surfaces of this space. And with the lobby reductions in terms of finishes, we provided gypboard painted wall there rather than plaster.
Gypboard meaning sheetrock.
Sheetrock. So visually, tone, paint, color, it's going to look consistent.
Yeah.
But from a texture perspective, there's a shift there from that acoustic plaster to.
So,
They want to walk into it later.
so to get back to the lobby size, I'm disappointed, but I'm pleased. I will say I've spent a lot of time with staff offline on dealing with where potential reduction and getting to that 400 square feet to see where the benefits are. And I think it's an exercise we probably should have taken a long time ago before we got this far into it. And I think we've gotten to a point where the benefits, a line of sight issue, you have staffing issues, a safety issue, a doorway realignment for the police department are now some things that become better, more in consideration. I wish we would have gotten to this before. I don't think I see the value in making the modification now. I think that should have been done more aggressively in the past because potentially it would have created a courtyard on the backside. But I just want you to know, and I thank you for doing this, because I know that it also had consideration for the upstairs programming issue related to the building and planning department gives the building department an area where the contractor submitted out plans. So significantly, a huge impact upstairs to go to the the pathway component. It kills anywhere where people can lay out stuff. I appreciate the fact that you considered this because it was important to evaluate the value of it. So if you can move on to the next one.
Yeah. So casework finishes, under the recommended column, we looked at actually taking the community development office, that second story, and pulling the office-related furnishings out into a separate budget. That's a $52,000 item. If we wanted to further add to that, some of those were wood veneer. We could look at Keelan, which would give an additional savings of $13,000. The secure walls, so similarly to the conversation we had around the glazing from a level 5 consideration, we did look at the level 3 again as something that our police consultant recommended as a potential savings that is still within the line of acceptable. That found a savings in both categories, both columns of $143,000. And that's for interior wall partitions, not glazing. Ceiling fans. We have ceiling fans located in office spaces in the lobby, and so that's across police department, lobby, and from the admin building. You'll notice that the number is a little less in the second column than it is on the right, and that's because we've deferred that program. So 37,000 versus 64,000 for a full building. I do want to note with the ceiling fans that we are still including wiring for potential future inclusion of those as well.
Perfect.
So the next item, area reduction, and the first one you'll notice the council chamber is one of those bold items. The original design actually looked at the council chamber as an ad alternate, with the idea that we may want some cost savings potential there. That was $1.65 million to defer that. As we move down the next line, eliminate temporary admin trailer, pad, and utility connections, and that was a value item of about $39,000. This in some ways plays well with the idea of the next item, which is also on reduction of phasing. And this is a portion of a number that was provided through Over's bid originally with the project. It's $400,000 savings in either item. Admittedly, this is something that's a little tough to put your arms around, but I think when we think about the phasing, if there are areas where we can combine efforts and sort of get more activity going on the site to reduce the complexity, your acceptance of the library demolition is an example of one of those that's going to potentially lead to some of this phasing savings.
Okay.
So if I could ask a question, sir.
Please, Bill.
So I want to understand, I think that we had talked about having the council chambers as an ad alternate. Is it an ad alternate or is it not?
It is.
Not in this, recommended. It's
Is it
included.
built as part of the base bid, or is it?
Well, it looks to me like it's included and recommended. It's not an alternate.
It can be, we can categorize it either way. I mean, per the bid documents, we had the council chamber broken out as an alternate, a deduct alternate, and that value was the 1.655. So the design works already.
Done the design that, when the bids come in, we say we can't afford the council chambers, that can be cut
You
out,
could still
and
defer
there's
that.
no additional design.
Correct.
Right.
So I
And
think,
that's-
I do see
that's
that
already been
as an
prepared.
alternate, not as a mandatory.
Okay. Any other questions? Rick, please.
So, at the last council meeting, Paul made a comment, which was that one of the complicating factors in the bid are the number of the ad alternates that we've had. And that when a contractor responds to a bid where there are a whole series of variables, they naturally are going to include some premium in it because they have to do the work to deal with that variable, which makes sense to me. I think that in this next bid, that it's very important for us to make this bid set of documents as simple as possible. And where there are ad alternates that are either additions or deducts, like the council chambers have been, I think it's fine to do it, but we have to understand there's a cost, which is that the contractor is going to add some premium. So I believe that it's our responsibility to address the hard issues now to the extent that we can. and make a judgment about what's right for this town in terms of what we're proposing to be built. Personally, I think it's a mistake to try to put this council chambers off, because we've gone through the analysis of what the cost is. And there's a significant cost to do it at a later time, like $500,000 was what you guys said to us the last time we looked at it, versus a $1.5 or $1.6 million savings to not do it now. So I'm of the opinion that it should be included in the bid documents and it shouldn't be a deduct. I think the same thing is true with any of the other issues. We should look at everything that would be an add-all and try to make a judgment on them. If we really think we're not gonna build it, like these thermal tanks, if we really think we're not gonna do it, take them out of the bid. And if we really think that we are gonna do it, then we should include it in the bid. For example, we've got two PVs that are off the bid right now. One are the PVs that would go on the building, and the other PVs that would go in the carports. And I think we should, it only makes sense when you run the numbers in terms of the operational costs to have the PVs, because it's cheaper for us and we don't have to pay for them, either if we do a PPA. We're gonna negotiate a cheaper rate. So I don't know what that means with respect to the carports, because I understand there's more infrastructure and more complexity there. But at least for the PVs that go on the building, I think we should put them on now and not make them an add-all.
I just have to really think about it, because I think that it's up to us, like, what we were talking about, the, decision of asphalt shingles versus clay tile, or, just building it with the intent to put PVs on from the beginning and just do it right the first time and not think that we're gonna, come back and retrofit, which always costs more money. I don't think the PPA would, pay for the structures on the carports, that support the PVs. I think that it's the PVs on top of the structures. So I'm not very, supportive of adding those as a, initial, in the bid packet that we're gonna do. So I would just like to take those out. The council chambers, I think that the people feel that we designed it and we should build it. And I think that we have enough evidence of financing and funding that it's in this recommended option right here, that, even with a budget gap of, 7.8, we can build it and we can finance it through our funding sources. So I think we should make the hard decisions now and do it right the first time.
Bill?
I have no problem with eliminating some of the add-ons. I think that's a good idea. That said, I don't agree with putting the PVs on right now. I could eliminate the microgrid right now. I could eliminate the carport thing right now. The laminate finished casework I could eliminate right now. That leaves just a couple alternates. I do think that 1.6 to $2 million is something that we ought to at least have that opportunity to say, hey, we're going to defer it, because we need to build something that we can afford. I understand you saying, hey, we can just go ahead and do another, raise the funds. I'm not in favor of going into debt. The pre-funding of your general fund opportunity, that sounds like a cash flow issue, but going further and further into debt is a problem. The issue is we don't know really what the costs are going to be. so we're kind of guessing. But we want to eliminate some things. You know, we've talked about it several times when we had 5 of us here, and it was 3 to 2 to push the PVs and things into the alternate and not have them in the base bid. And one of the council members who was part of that majority isn't here now, so I think pushing it into the base bid, pushing it back into the base bid is inappropriate.
Would everybody like to say comments related to the heating system, the VRF system? I think there was a pretty good consistency on keeping the original system that we had. Is that still
I agree.
Bill?
Yeah, keep going with the library system, I think is a good idea.
And Rick, I assume you agree with that? So that answers your question and covers your.
So, okay, so we're going to eliminate, we're gonna keep the campus-wide system as currently designed, and then that VRF system, the savings, the $398,000, that goes away. So that adds another $400,000. So the estimated savings then at 3.2 million would be about 2.8 million is what we're at.
For the library,
Run the
no,
numbers.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Please, would you
Right.
Decide on the
Right.
items.
Yeah, I think we're gonna do a rundown on the numbers as you go down the recommended aisle. I will just opine on a couple things because they're overdue issues. As far as the council chambers is concerned, sure, in a perfect world, I'd love to have it built. But 40% and consideration of overbids, I can't really feel that comfortable about how the bids are coming into play. I don't see much of a reason why it can't be a valued option just in case we have a problem. I mean, that's a big number, and it's something that we can, it's already drawn, so there's really no big issue of leaving it on as we have it set up now under the recommended option, and we have that option later on. As far as the carport option, I don't believe leaving on that as an alternate is necessary at this point. I am still comfortable with leaving the PV option as an alternate. The microgrid, I'm okay with removing the microgrid as an option. But again, and I also echo Bill's comments, I would like to give them, unfortunately, because of circumstances of, and frankly, I'll blame it on myself, I'm the one that actually changed the time, thinking that we'd have everybody here. But that didn't happen, so, we have to have options. In a perfect world, we'd have nothing as alternates, but that doesn't give us any degree of flexibility and gives us a commitment, and kind of in the same scenario that we kind of landed with the original bid component. But I think that if we do some reductions in alternates, we'll be far better off than, a line of alternates. So related to plugging down, can we start plugging down row number 3 on recommended options, please? And I think that's, please, George.
So the first one with a number in front of it is the windows, the storefront, the mock-up, the precast, that's the 300, or the
No.
595,000
Yeah.
in total.
But
Yep.
that includes asphalt shingle
Correct.
in lieu of clay tile.
Fine.
I disagree with that.
So that's the only where there's a variable. What about the asphalt shingle and clay tile?
The clay tile, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the clay tile is currently designed as an alternate in this concept, correct?
So this,
No.
it's the opposite. The asphalt would be provided here. Now, I think the key driver on asphalt versus clay tile is going to be that PV item. If that PV PPA is something you're looking to do in the short term, the recommendation would still be to maintain the asphalt shingle.
But we're wiring for the PV for the Cal Green standard.
You're going to wire regardless.
Right, and so our hope is in the future we'll be able to add that. It's just right now, due to the cost of getting the whole thing done, we may not be able to afford it, and that's why we're saying it's an alternate. So I think being prepared for implementing that alternate is the right thing to do, and I would go with the asphalt.
The asphalt is, just remember, is the entirety of the roof,
Yeah.
not just those areas where there's.
I'm okay with that.
I'm not.
Rick, please.
Yeah, I'm okay with the asphalt roof on the whole building. I think we should do the PV on the building, and if we don't wanna pay for it, let's just find somebody else to pay for it. That's fine, and I don't think it costs us anything. It's just a matter of whether we get the energy for free, because we pay for it up front, or we pay for the energy at a reduced price, because we entered into a PPA.
So in a hypothetical here, having the asphalt as a primary, we can always obviously add the clay tile at a later date, which would increase the Class A rating of the roof itself. So you get a better fire protection, but in a perspective, if there's the possibility of PV, you have to have the asphalt as a base.
I'd really recommend the asphalt. You can do the PV
Yeah.
and the clay tile. It's not to say that that's mutually exclusive.
Right.
But the roof structure's gonna be different though, for a clay
With an
tile, for
asphalt
that.
The loading is
structure.
different.
Yeah, so
We
you're
don't
gonna
want
have to,
to build an
It-
inferior
You would
roof
have to design
system,
that for a future.
Yeah.
so that we cannot put clay tile on in the future. And I think you're just kind of wasting money. The addition is $292,000 to add the clay tile. So instead of this be 590,000, it'd be 300,000 savings. Right.
And that clay tile is as designed, which
Uh-huh.
meant that that was the lobby portion of the building
Yeah.
and the admin.
Mhm.
The police base bid, original drawings, was also clay tile.
Mhm.
And then our PV alternate looked at the removal of that clay tile from the police department, pushed asphalt shingles onto that roof, and PV included.
Mhm.
And so that PV number kind of does that switch, if you will, just at the police.
So the change to asphalt did not have any redesign component. You have a higher load capacity in the base design.
It's already, yeah, it's
So
already
there,
gonna be
so you're not
designed.
doing any design changes to.
Right. Either case, the design fees here are pretty minimal because we've worked through both scenarios. It's just more whether we would wanna carry one as an alternate or whether we wanna make a decision now. And I think, again, the PV is gonna kinda drive what that finish wants to be.
Please.
I just would like to
come up.
thank you, Rachel. Okay, sorry. Two things. The first thing is that one of the most important things that the residents said to us was about the look and the feel of a residential garden, Santa Barbara look and feel for the property, whatever it was. And we went through all sorts of looks and feels, from modern to everything, and it came down to a Santa Barbara look and feel. And that absolutely includes tiles, or at least the look of the clay tiles, and also to mimic this building, which has clay tiles. So I remember WRNS was very specific in mimicking and building the buildings so that they would, look good together. So that was important. The second part that I'm not hearing from you guys about any of the reductions in space and so forth is the use of community for community events. And we really promoted this new town center as a place for community and community events. And everybody got really excited about that. A hall, the building with a hallway in between is an area for a community event. Spaces outside are for community events, and spaces inside the council chamber is a reusable, what do we call it, a flexible space? And that's a place where people want to make use of it as a community event sort of space. We've got indoor, outdoor areas. We've got we can remove all the chairs and use it for the community. So I just want to remind everybody that if you're reducing space, the space you're reducing is the space that the community wanted to use. Okay.
Thank you.
So I would like to propose that we want to put as an alternate the PVs on the police station, so that as we go forward in trying to get a PPA agreement put together to install the PVs, we have that as a bid alternate. Through.
Yes, we're at. I think we're really, just really in building, roofing material is really the only issue of keeping the, clay tiles as it is, and the add alt of the composition shingle. Is that really what we put down at
Right.
this point? And with the recommendation of design perspective, this is not a, I mean, it sounds like we're gonna be a little bit of a stalemate. I'm not really too sure if the PVs are ever gonna happen. But I don't want, and I know design issues, but you already have the load design for the tile roof as it is,
And for PV.
as well as for PV, and I'm not really, I can't imagine that there's much to deal with if you're changing over the clay tile to a composition in an area where you're adding PV to it. I don't know how much of a degree that would be, if there was a need for PV, because you're not gonna put the PV on tile. You're gonna remove tile and then PV, and then, or composition and then PV over. But you have to have the proper joints, and I don't know how the layout roof-wise would be conducive of how much work that would be.
The PV introduce an uplift factor. That's the key design perimeter around the PV.
The uplift factor.
Right.
If you put it over tile.
Right. Well, or regardless, just the nature of that physical construction sitting on a roof is going to present more of an uplift condition. Again, both of these are designed, right? We've looked at, so our base condition right now, clay tile everywhere, with an alternate that says focused use of asphalt shingles, police with PV over it. And that's something we could maintain if that's kind of the direction you guys are most comfortable. But I think I would lean to Paul to maybe kind of qualify what you think might be a reasonable number of alternates. My gut says it's 3 to 4.
I'd agree with that.
Okay, yeah. So if we could kind of keep an
And I think
alternate list that's
a
focused.
reasonable alternate.
Yeah,
We had 9 last time, I think.
yeah.
Yeah, and just perspective of if Mike opines and says he wants composition, then we can make that modification. And then,
Well,
You're providing direction today to WRNS so that they can craft their scope of work. And if next, on the 19th, Mike comes into the conversation and says, you know, I'm uncomfortable, I would rather have clay tile everywhere, then there's not really much of a scope of work
Right.
change.
Clay tile is already the base, so
and I think that we should just keep it that way.
The
So
key-
that their scope of work, they're not redesigning anything. I think what they've got is the design is the alternate of the PVs.
I'd rather have the clay tile as an alternate and go with the asphalt and get the savings that we can get. That's my 2 cents, and then the roof would be prepared for PV if we can move forward, which would also have been an alternate bid.
Here,
Rick, please.
so I don't know what I'm missing here.
Right.
If we put up the PVs,
Yep.
whether we pay for them or not, the energy's gonna be cheaper, so our operating costs will be lower. We can enter into a PPA, they're done all over the place. We can enter into a PPA to put if we don't wanna pay for the PVs, we can enter into it, we've got time to do that. It doesn't make any sense to me to do that later, because
I agree.
it won't cost us anything to put on the PVs if we have a PPA. It'll just mean we have to pay for the energy at a lesser rate than we would be paying for the energy if we don't put them up.
And why would we want to pay a lesser rate? Because it's a lesser rate.
Yeah, but it's a,
Difference between capital
if it's-
cost and.
No, but there's no capital cost. There's no capital cost, so that PPA covers the capital cost.
but at this point in time, there is a capital cost,
What is that?
because we don't have the PPA.
Well, we can do, but do we have an authorized staff to do it? We've got plenty of time to get that done before we go out to bid.
That's what I think also.
This is not a tough thing to do.
I still think myself personally is keeping this an alternate, and making that decision as the PPA gets, if it got, I mean, it's all about perfect world. Perfect world, we'd have composition, not have to worry about the clay tile, but we'd have everybody here to say, you know, that decision could be made. We can keep the design as it is and have the alternate as the composition shingle, then the composition would be applicable to that. But although you just said,
Only on the
somebody said that by raising the panels, you can actually put the panels over the clay tile, which is not the most
No,
desirable.
you don't.
No,
Yeah.
You don't wanna do that.
It's gotta be asphalt shingle.
And I challenge my fellow to, look at the result of putting asphalt shingles on this style of building. It is abhorrent, it's really a bad idea. It will look terrible. It will, the roof is like the crowning glory of any building. And the whole look and feel of the building incorporates the clay tiles. And we knew going in it was gonna be a little more expensive, and then asphalt shingles, and then if we do the clay, if we do the PDs, under those, under the PDs where they're gonna be, would be asphalt shingles. So I just think that the way it's been designed, let's not ask WRNS to redesign anything at this point. We'll leave the PDs as an alternate, and by the time we go out to bid, we can have a PPA agreement with an outside vendor to pay for the PDs, and we won't have to pay for them.
Under the recommended, it is the current design, which is tile, correct?
No.
The recommended option is, so the 303,000 is the
Net.
window glazing, aluminum storefront windows, et cetera, et cetera. 292,000 additional makes it to the 595, and that's asphalt in lieu of clay tile. If you wanna keep it as designed, clay tile in lieu of asphalt, and put asphalt as your alternate, then the savings is only 303.
303, and that's significant. We're
That's
reducing
the
the
direction.
glazing, we're reducing the aluminum storefront windows, we're reducing the precast elements, and the exterior mock-up.
I think I'm gonna switch a little bit here and say that the recommended design with the asphalt and savings of 595, and then having the clay tile as an alternate is the route to go.
I agree.
Okay, so move on.
But
Wait,
Good?
that was 3.
I can count.
So what he wants to do,
is
George.
that what you?
Well, that's what I'm just clarifying.
Yeah,
I mean, I
I
heard two
didn't-
here, I think we were sitting here on the fence with two.
yeah,
and then-
I don't think we're,
I'm indifferent about it. I mean, I think if we have asphalt tiles, I agree. We have clay tiles on this roof. It would look far better to have clay tiles on that roof. I agree with that. It's a $300,000 savings to put asphalt on the roof. If I'm gonna invest $300,000, I mean,
That's at the cost of the PV.
I'm indifferent about it. I think that I think the asphalt tiles won't look as good, and it'll make it look like a cheaper building. I do believe that.
well, and you know,
But
Councilmember
It
Whitmer
is
wanted
being
to
a
take
cheaper
out,
building.
Councilmember Whitmer wanted to take out the hydro seeding, the landscaping of 162,000. That's 50%, so we're gonna leave that in, and we're gonna have that savings. He wanted to take that out. So, I mean, you know, you're picking and choosing as you're going along.
That's what we're supposed to be doing.
Understand, but you've got, at some point, you have to have some quality.
Well,
You have to have a standard that you're going to, adhere to. You can't make this an aberration.
But we have to also consider, when we're considering reductions, we have to come up with some reductions, and
I think we have, Mayor, I think we've come up with a lot of reductions.
Why don't we leave this issue until the 5 of us?
yeah,
That's the
it's,
scope of work level.
Yeah.
Okay, so the
We're gonna have to
292,000
revisit
part
this
is.
for the contract, just like we're doing with the library contract today.
yeah,
Okay, so that one's in here.
that was in the air.
And the next one is the $82,000 savings.
That's fine.
It's okay.
Okay. The next one with a number, we decided on the VRF system, we're doing the heat pump system campus-wide.
Go back to
So the next one was a number is the 162,
Yeah.
to the hydro seed, does that stay in?
Yep.
It's around-
Site furnishings, 18,000.
it's around that they're-
Cedar fencing, Ashfield Road, 12,000.
Yep.
delete the courtyard improvements, 8037.
Yeah.
Acoustic ceilings, simplify railings, eliminate the gate at CDD, 426.
I'm concerned about the exposed steel beams, what that looks like, just saying.
I'm concerned about the size, just saying.
426 is in there as well. Reducing the casework, 52,000.
And add the plastic laminate over to it.
Add as part of the base bid, the plastic laminate.
Yeah, the 13,000 savings.
I need 3. Is that a go for that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you get
It's
that?
plastic laminate on the,
Casework,
Casework.
on the, you know, instead of
On the-
wood veneer,
wait, that's for the tables, is that right?
Right, any of the
Or is
casework
that the
that would be,
vertical veneer?
it's anything, not the countertops, but the actual verticals, so your doors, your sides on your casework. And this is just at community development.
That's plastic rather than wood?
Right.
It's
I paid
P-lam.
the wood for $13,000.
well, but it's still wood laminate.
It's a peeling.
It,
Right.
P-lam, which is more of a,
Plastic laminate.
right, the wood veneer gives you a grain, right, a more natural, in some ways forgiving, durable
There
finish,
are
whereas the P-lam.
plastic laminates that look like wood.
Plastic laminate
And
can look like anything.
Can you explain
like-
the
I have this
scope of
table
it?
right
How many cabinets are we talking about?
It's just for the community development office. So this is for the space that would be upstairs,
Uh-huh.
on the smaller admin building.
Uh,
Square footage of that is about 3,000 square feet.
It's an additional 13,000.
But is it in
Yeah,
every
just in finish.
office?
So this is all the built-ins that are around the plan development desks and
Take it
storage
out.
units.
Take it out, move on.
Take it out, meaning add the 13,000.
Add
to the
13, please.
Let's do that, okay. All right, ballistic sheathing, level 5 to level 3, 64,000. I'm sorry, I missed one. 143,000.
Yeah.
143. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Should be 2, but.
Removing the ceiling fan, 64,000. On-site pad utilities, 39,000.
Yeah.
And site phasing deduction estimate, 400,000.
Yeah.
I mean, that could be $500,000, that could be $1 million. We don't know. That's a very mushy number. I think somebody took a dartboard and threw it at it.
With the 292,000, if that is added as part of the deducts, your savings would be 2.84. And then without it, it is 2.41, or 2.54. Sorry, 2.54.
The biggest is the VRF system. The 370,000 that we did, yeah.
Okay, we have direction on that particular one.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the next item. Oh, and any final public comments on that item? Please, Dee.
I'm gonna throw some cold water on you all, and you knew that. But I think with the council chambers being left in and no reduction in that entry mall, we have the possibility of losing at least $2 million. I know that it doesn't seem that anybody up here really cares about it because there's all these other ways to finance, but I think you ought to be aware of that. And now that I'm seeing where the council's going, I have to make a presentation to some of the donors who are waiting to hear, and I don't think it's gonna go over well. So, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Moving to item number 3, please.
Mayor, this is to direct staff to request a redesign proposal from WRNS Studios for a council-approved VE options for the administrative police building. And that pretty much is based on the direction we just received from you regarding item number 2. So we're requesting that you ask us to get a proposal from WRS for the VE items that you just approved for the admin police building, and we'll bring that back for your consideration on September 19th.
Okay. Any questions from council? Seeing none, I think we beat this one. Any members of the public comment on this item? Seeing none, close public comment, back to us.
Number 4, Mayor, is to authorize the city.
Wait,
Oh.
I need to give you some direction.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So attachment 3,
That one.
right? We're looking at
Yes,
attachment 3.
we'll get that one through. So we need,
It's-
This isn't the library,
No, this is-
you're giving direction to staff to ask for a proposal from February.
That's
Right, attachment 3, I'm gonna talk about right now.
Okay,
I'm gonna
sorry,
talk about
that's
that
what I
right-
was saying.
I'm gonna talk about that
Motion
now.
for that, that's just staff direction, correct?
Yes,
And you already got that?
correct.
And we're good? And
Well, we
already
just
go on
talked
item
about
number 4?
Oh,
Okay, yes.
Item 4 is authorize the city attorney to prepare and the city manager to execute an agreement amendment with WNS Studios to perform the redesign work for the library. And this is attachment 3. And I don't know if we can bring that up, city clerk, attachment 3 there. And the one thing that will change now is, let's see, we'll wait till she gets it
Item
up.
number 3, bullet point
Bullet number 3 will now go away, which is central plant change of campus central plant air-cooled heat pump to split heat pump designed solely for the library. So that scope of work will be eliminated, and we'll get a revised cost, because right now it's lump sum for $199,975, and I couldn't tell you, and I'm sure John couldn't tell either, how much of that. There'll be savings by not doing that central plant redesign. How much, we just can't say, but I'm gonna be requesting WNS to give us a revised proposal that eliminates that third bullet there.
It would be less than 285,750.
Correct.
Elizabeth?
So I have a question. It says the acoustic treatment modify in main space that ensure acoustic target is maintained. Could you explain that? Because I was under the impression that we were maintaining the fabric ceilings.
Right, no, that's a good question. And you're right, the fabric ceilings are maintained, but we did find savings, if you recall, the library book wall.
Right,
We had
taking
acoustic
that fabric
paneling.
out?
Right, so
Okay.
the paneling that was on the lower portion of that wall, we're removing. And we're still gonna design, obviously, to the requirements within the space.
Okay.
But the ceiling would remain.
Okay. Any other questions? Any members of the public, any comments on this item? Seeing none, I'm gonna close public comment, bring it back to the council. And, can I get a motion to authorize?
So moved.
Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Let's go ahead and move to the last item.
Item number 5, Mayor, is authorize staff to advertise for public bids to provide demolition abatement services for the library building. As you might recall, at the August 17th meeting, you gave us direction to prepare a bid package for that, and at that point, we were estimating the demolition cost to be in the neighborhood of $140,000. But now the engineer's estimate, and Paul will speak to this here in a second, is about $440,000, because the scope has changed or increased a little bit. And Paul, do you want to speak to that?
So initially, the removal of the library building was just the building, and we realized as we looked at that scope that it was a little bit limiting. And so we thought it would be better to add all of the site, capping off the utilities, scraping down all of the hardscape there, so that when the contractor did come on board, he's got a clean pad to work with. In addition, we'd overlooked the hazmat component of the existing library and having to remove that. So that's how we went from the 140 plus another 80 for the hazmat, plus another 128 for the site work to get us up to the, plus the markups on that too, 438,000, rounding up to 440.
So this is up to 440?
Because the hazmat's an allowance.
And at this point, we think that by doing all of that work, we're going to save from 1 to 2 months of the general contractor on the larger projects time duration. And our current assumptions about burn rate are about $230,000 a month. So there could be, $450,000 savings there.
That's where that phasing, yeah.
That's that phasing.
Right, exactly. That's part of that phasing.
All right, any questions from council?
No, so moved.
So, I have a question.
Please.
So that increased cost that we would be incurring, that you
Sure. Yeah, off the top, there's probably more savings because of doing it earlier. We've talked about smaller contractor, less overhead. But yes, we would have had to done that work one place or the other. So,
Do you know
And
exactly
it
how
was
much that
gonna
is?
be paid for by the library funds,
Do you know exactly how much that is?
the
The saving?
savings,
which savings?
which savings?
Between having this and then part of, separate versus the part of the GC scope.
It'll be determined by the general contractor's schedule whether we can save a month or two, so that's speculation.
And this also may be something that could be attractive to somebody to come in and start right away.
Exactly.
It makes a lot of sense to me.
All right, any other questions for anybody?
Just to confirm what Elizabeth asked, so this is a library expense?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct. I think we need a motion on this.
Oh, we will.
Okay.
Just a second, I will. Hold on. Any members of the public, any comment on this item? Seeing none, close public comment, and can I get a motion?
So
I
moved.
have a comment. Normally we have comments before we vote.
True.
I have a comment.
I really want to hear it.
So I'd like to make sure that we amend the direction to the staff that, when we're doing the tree protection, that we also put a tree protection zone to make sure that that is, addressing the neighbor's trees, because there are a lot of trees that are not necessarily on this parcel, but are on the neighbor's parcel. And just because they're on the other side of the fence doesn't mean we can tear them up, okay? And
Absolutely.
we don't do a great job at that, but I would like to make sure that we do it.
Not only the trees, Councilmember, but the house itself, everything's.
Yeah. But we
So,
wanna make sure that the tree protection
Right.
zone, as we currently have in our thing, is blocked off, so they're not,
absolutely, and then
Okay, that's
protection
all.
of this building too, so.
yeah, thank you very much.
Any other comments before we move to the motion? For the second on the motion? Seeing none, can I get a second on the motion, please? Second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much, and a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mayor.
everybody for coming.